Welcome to Part 5. In this section, we're going to study very deeply and thoroughly the relationships between the Jesuits and communism. Many people today are waking up, quote unquote, waking up to the evils of the left, to communistic philosophies, to socialism, to the enemy, to the evils of these things. But this is all by design, folks. And in this section, I hope that you will realize it as we tie this last satanic thread into the picture. Communism is designed to have an agenda. It's not just something that spontaneously arose in history and we have to stamp it out because it's super evil. It's something that was designed, practiced, and of course eventually implemented throughout the world to bring the world back to the beast. This is what you need to understand about today. The communistic experiment is coming to an end. It's coming to an end. It's only been about 200 years, but it's coming to an end. And people are ready, as a result of that agenda being fulfilled, to be deceived by a false golden age, by a counterfeit eternity, by a counterfeit salvation, by a counterfeit gospel, by religion, by nationalism, by all of the things that communism is designed to glorify. And if you don't understand that connection right away, don't worry, we'll make it very plain today. Why this matters is because communism is the bad cop to make Catholicism look good. It's to make Catholicism be the solution. Again, imagine being a fly on the wall in the Jesuit, sanctum where they're getting together and planning the overthrow of the world. Imagine what it would take to make people believe that going back to a medieval style government where the Pope is the God King over all of the nation states of the world, and people are willingly pledging their power to this entity. What is it going to take? You got to think problem, reaction, solution. What is it going to take to make that particular reality something desirable, something that makes sense, something that looks good, that's rational? What is it going to take to make insanity look good? The Bible says, woe to those that make good evil and evil good. And this is exactly what we're dealing with. You're dealing with something so evil in Antichrist. And ultimately, the goal is to make that evil Antichrist thing, which is the papal power ruling over the world, look desirable and good and making sense. So how do you do that? How do you make such an insane outcome desirable as the solution? And of course, the answer is communism. Communism is the answer. Communism is the bad cop that makes the good cop look good. You'll learn as we go through this, but communism does many things for the beast. It destroys the family, so that the beast can then come and rescue you with family policies and give you family time on Sunday, which of course is the whole point why the beast is about the family. You have to remember that. The beast could care less about your family. The reason the beast is about the family is because it's easier to persuade people to take the mark and to enjoin in this pagan system of worshiping the sun, which of course is worshiping the devil. If you have two family members and they're sold on Sunday sacredness, it's much easier to convince the rest of the family because people are in groups and they cave to peer pressure, especially people that they're very close with. Do you get it? Do you get how diabolical this is? The whole push for family values and getting back to the family is not about the family, folks. It's about Sunday sacredness. That is the ultimate goal. So communism does a great job at destroying the family and family values, traditional gender roles. Why do you think they do that? They do that so the beast can come and rescue you with its morality and say, look, we're about the family. We denounce this atheistic system. We need to go back to the family. Because, of course, family is all about Sunday. Communism also destroys spirituality so that the beast can come in and give you its counterfeit gospel of religion. Again, when my cover on True Antichrist, Man of Lawlessness Revealed, my cover where I have Pope John Paul spreading his arms out in Poland. And of course, Satan in the background as a dragon looking onward. I think that was pretty clever. But anyway, I think it's true, honestly. I was like, how can I portray this accurately, really spiritually here? And it's true. Satan is looking onward as people are marveling after his vicar on earth. But that's a perfect picture of what this conversation is about. That picture right there with Pope John Paul II spreading his arms for tens of thousands of Poles who are desperately sick of the atheistic paradigm being shoved down their throats. We were made to worship God, folks. We were made to be spiritual beings in the sense, I don't mean that in like a Gnostic way or in any New Agey way. I just mean that in a way that we are crafted and designed to have a spiritual experience with God, because God is spirit. So we are made to have spiritual experiences. That's why the commandment on idolatry is so important, because if you do not worship God, God made you to worship God, to be a vessel for spiritual movement. And so if you don't worship God and you put God first in your life, then you will worship something else, because you're made to have spiritual experiences. And of course, there are other spirits besides God, and that's the whole point. So the commandment on idolatry is because we are made to worship God. The point is, we can't get away from our spiritual nature. We can't get away from worship. You get it? You can't get away from that. And atheism is insanity. It's the insanity of insanities, because the idea that all of this came from nothing and the world is meaningless and, you're just a cog in a wheel. This is the complete antithesis of what we are as human beings. But that's by design. That is by design, so that the beast can then come in and seem reasonable when it offers you God again. But of course, it's not offering you the God of the Bible. It's offering you the God of religion, which of course is the devil. So this is the point. Communism destroys your spirituality on purpose so that the beast can come in and bring it back through religion. Communism also destroys sexuality so that the beast can provide you with traditional values. You look at all the liberals today and LGBTQ, every time they're adding. In fact, recently in one of my Venerable Day of the Sun episodes, I covered a fascinating phenomenon. Gays going red, i.e. turning conservative. So now you have all of this woke stuff that's backfiring on them. Of course, it's all being self-destructive. It's by design. So don't think for a moment that these things are just happening. But nevertheless, the extremes are being rooted out. Now the gays themselves are turning on the trans, on the, queers, on whatever other letters there are part of the alphabet. The gays are turning on these people and saying, look, you guys ruined it for us. We had it fine. We just wanted to get married and that was it. We're going to start voting conservative because this is too much. Even the liberals are saying this is too much. So the liberalism is coming to an end, extreme liberalism. Liberalism will become religious again. Liberalism will swing much more conservative than it used to be. But you can see in the last, especially couple decades, that liberalism has gone more and more and more and more like crazy, absolutely crazy. That's by design, folks. That's by design, to give you such a reaction to where something like religion seems completely rational and good. Because otherwise, if you didn't have that thing poking and prodding at you and pulling you this way, then religion, you might, God forbid, you might have some discernment and realize that religion is almost right and it's a counterfeit. Do you get it? When you're off balance emotionally, you cannot have discernment. If you're afraid, if you're anxious, if you're in lust, if you are any kind of emotion, the devil uses. He doesn't care as long as you're not on balance mentally, not on walking the narrow road. Because if you're off balance, then all you need to do is just push you a little bit this way or put you a little that way, and you can fall. So when you are under an emotional trance of whatever kind, whether it's fear or desire or anything else, you will get thrown off balance. And so if you aren't off balance, then you can have discernment, right? Makes sense. It makes sense. Again, I've used this example so many times when I used to teach dancing, and I've used it in, other situations too, because I think it's a very poignant example that I learned from the world of movement. If you just stand up and you're standing nice and straight, you can move in any direction. You can look around. You're ready to move in any direction. If you're leaning back quite a bit, I'm going to try to do it here and still talk to you so that you can hear me. If you're leaning back or you're leaning forward, quite a bit, you can feel the more you do those things, the more you lean one direction or another, the more your muscles are clamping on, trying to hold you up, and you have all this tension in your body. You don't know if you're going to fall, and it gets worse and worse the more off balance you are. That physical reality, which is true and physical and measurable, you can do it in your home, just be safe, is a microcosm or a symbol or an example, metaphor, parable of how the world of ideas and beliefs and emotions work. If you are really off balance, it doesn't take much to push you into apostasy, right? That's the point. If you're really off balance and your muscles are squeezing, you're not relaxed and you really can't think logically, can you? So this is the point. And the devil tries constantly through dialectics to push you either to the right or to the left. Liberalism is designed to push people so hard in one direction that they are no longer thinking critically and they accept the solution that's provided to them. Communism also destroys personal sovereignty. In other words, the sense of property, the sense of the individual, all the things that are sacred to the human mind. God gave us an individuality. He gave us names. He gave us property in the sense, of course, everything is His, but He gives, if you look, for example, from Genesis, all the earth is yours, go and subdue it. Of course, God owns the earth, but He's giving it to us to have and to inherit with Him in the end. And of course, everybody's going to have their own vineyard and all these things part of the eternal state. There's definitely a sense where God, though He owns everything, shares that with us and gives us each our own property or stuff. I don't want to say stuff because it sounds materialistic, but you know what I mean. Like, it's not wrong to have your own place. It's not wrong to have your own piece of land. It's not wrong to have your own property. I think that's God's intention, is that we all have our own space, right? We're individuals. We have names. We have communities. We have homes. We have maybe things we're growing, like a vineyard or a garden. That's by design. I think that God wants that. So, of course, the communistic paradigm, which of course is designed by the beast, is going to rob that from you. Why? So the beast can come in and be God to you in your life. The beast is one that's bringing back all of this stuff through nationalism and property rights again and sovereignty and rights and human rights and blah, blah, blah. All of this is just dialectical nonsense. In fact, if most people don't realize that if you just follow the Ten Commandments, you don't need something like a Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is a humanistic, deistic, Luciferian, Freemason notion of ruling yourself. It's a notion of ruling yourself and basically being your own sovereign. That's where those ideas come from. Oh, my rights this, my rights that. What rights? What rights do you have? You're made in God's image. And as a result, God has given us the earth through Christ. But treat others as you want to be treated and love God with all your whole heart and mind and soul. That's the only things you need to do. You don't need rights. And if everybody followed that paradigm, and if everybody was born again, there would be no need for rights or all this nonsense. Which, of course, we can look forward to in the eternal state where there's going to be a perfect government. Perfect government, everybody's going to be completely satisfied, and Christ will be on earth ruling forever, which is something to look forward to. So all of this nonsense will come to an end. The point, folks, is that communism was not created by the Jews, as most people think. It was actually older than Karl Marx. Communism started with the Jesuit Reductions in South America, and you will learn quite a bit about them today. They practiced that model for about 150 years before the French Revolution, and of course the French Revolution, after that the rest is history, because it brought the two-party dialectical system and atheism and socialism into the world. Remember that the beast uses the Jews as scapegoats to blame for all of their nefarious activities behind the scenes, and of course to set a precedent for persecuting Sabbath keepers in the end. All of the hatred that people have towards the Jews and Jewish involvement in communism is going to be transferred onto you as a Sabbath-keeping Christian when everybody is converted and everybody has come into this new thing. You will be a Judaizer. And of course, with the term Judaizer comes a lot of stuff. It comes with Zionism, communism, all the dirty tricks that have been in history. So be aware. The Jews are involved with communism. That's undeniable. There were many Jews that brought communism to many countries, but they're secret society members. In my video, Why the Jews Are Not God's Chosen People, you can see a picture of all of the Bolsheviks. Karl Marx, Stalin, Trotsky, I forget some of the other two, but they're all sitting there with their pictures with their hands in their coats. Freemason signaling. So again, the Jews at the top are not Jews. They're Synagogue of Satan. They're betrayers. They could care less about their own people. They just want power and money, and they have no character. And so, don't get the two confused. The Jews did bring communism to many countries. However, they were Jesuit puppets, and they were practicing Jesuit ideals. They were doing the biddings of their masters. After the reductions, the Jesuits were very wealthy and they were influencing many countries. You will learn why, what the reductions are today if you have never heard of that. The monarchs in Europe at the time hated the Jesuits because of this. Remember the confessional booths, the various, intrigues and networks of spies and stuff like that. All of these things came to a head at some point right in the 18th century, in the 1700s. And the monarchs got sick of it. And so they started kicking all the Jesuits out. And of course, eventually, the Pope just went along with the pressure and banned the Jesuits. And the Jesuits said, oh, okay, well, we'll show you how to play ball. They assassinated the Pope. They had him arrested. They assassinated him. They fomented the French Revolution, toppled monarchies throughout the world, spread this idea of democracy and two-party systems and voting and everything else into the rest of the world for the last 200 plus years. So the French Revolution was basically a catalyst. It was an inflection point where many things changed. The mortal wound was given to the beast, the seeming mortal wound, because it just went underground and came back. But the mortal wound, and of course the dialectical system between right and left, communism, nationalism. You also had Zionism, of course. We talked about that in the last section with Napoleon and everything else. Just like with Hollywood, how that system of creating a center for exporting all the witchcraft and programming was practiced in the Jesuit theaters for hundreds of years in Europe. Just like Zionism goes beyond Theodor Herzl and Moses Hess to Napoleon and the Jesuits and their false eschatology, in the same way, communism is linked to not Karl Marx. Everybody knows. Karl Marx is the front man. He's the easy, low-hanging fruit that you can hate. Atheist, Jewish, probably a secret society member, very disheveled. He just looks like the kind of guy that you would believe is a villain. He looks like a villain. Do you get it? He's the one that they propped up so you can hate. The real originators of communism is not Karl Marx and Engels. Engels and Marx were just puppets. Remember, Engels was a quote-unquote Protestant. Of course, you know what that means by now. But the point is, learning the truth about communism is very important. It's important because you can escape the temptation to blame the Jews as the ultimate enemy, which is going to be more and more in the coming months and years. It really is, unfortunately, but that's just the way things go. It's also very important to escape the temptation to join the movement of religious nationalism that is coming, the false light, as the solution to all of the woke agenda, quote unquote. Because it's not the solution. Jesus Christ is the only solution. But these things are designed to give you a counterfeit solution. The question you have to ask yourself is this: once you learn the truth about communism, the million-dollar question is this: if the people who are coming to rescue you are also the people who started the problem, what does that mean? What does it mean? Trump is a Jesuit-educated, surrounded by Catholics, puppet of the Pope. And he's going to bring all of the attention that he's gaining, like a Judas goat, throughout the whole world. Politically, he's going to bring that back to the papal power. That's his role. He's surrounded by Opus Dei, militant Catholics, Jesuits. He's surrounded by that. Of course, he's also playing the Jews with his Zionist involvements, and people think, oh, he's controlled by the Zionists. No, the Zionists do not control anything, folks. Not ultimately. So you need to realize that he's playing the Jews because the Jews need to be converted. And they need to first taste that materialistic salvation. So they are completely off balance. At least the ones in the bottom, they're going to be ready for a charismatic revival, whether they realize it or not. The ones at the top, whatever, we'll be Catholic, we'll be Protestant. What's the new thing called? Sure, sign me up. Doesn't matter. I'm still a 33rd degree Freemason in the background. Synagogue of Satan. So this is what you need to realize, folks, and I hope that today will inoculate you against these deceptions. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So this is from, I want to look at the Jesuit Reductions and look at a couple of very important places, like essays, books, and things so you can learn more about these. Because on Wikipedia, you're not going to learn a great deal about them, of course, because there's a lot of controversial aspects to them. This is from a paper by Walter Nonnemann. It's called On the Economics of the Socialist Theocracy of the Jesuits in Paraguay, 1609 to 1767. So again, they were there for about 150 years, approximately. From 1609, the Jesuits governed a socialist theocracy in Paraguay. Never more than 200 Jesuits managed a Guarani Indian population of up to 150,000 people in a network of over 35 reductions, or missions, dispersed over an area twice the size of France and encapsulated in the Spanish-Portuguese colonial system. So, remember, the beast has dominion not by his own power. The Spaniards colonized and conquered these poor people. And of course, the Jesuits came in after they've been subdued and implemented this system. And of course, they had the sword of the Spanish and Portuguese army at their disposal. In spite of external political adversity, war, and epidemics, the Jesuit state in Paraguay reached extraordinary levels of economic welfare, surpassing standards of living even of many European areas at the time. The acceptance of the Jesuit governance by the Guaranis in the early years of the Jesuit state was stimulated by external threats such as the Portuguese slave traders, Paulistas, and the early Spanish colonialists adopting the encomienda system of personal service and forced labor. By the end of the 17th century, the Jesuit state had grown into a fully developed and well-organized command economy. The Jesuits imported and adapted Western technological know-how and organizational methods to local circumstances. They organized the semi-nomadic Guaranis into local, relatively self-sufficient, sedentary agricultural economies, with artisan production and basic manufacturing, division of labor, and specialization combined with internal and external trade. This is a very nice way of putting it, but you'll learn more about what actually was happening. This is communism under Jesuitism. They planned the production of public goods, structural saving and investment, and provided for social insurance and external security. Jesuit rule was high on loyalty and low on repression. Loyalty was derived from heavy investments in religious indoctrination, but also based on successful military and diplomatic protection of the Indian population. Repression was limited by incorporating indigenous customs and structures of authority. The Jesuit state came to an abrupt end when the Jesuits were expelled first from Portugal and its colonies in 1758, and later also from Spain and its dependencies in 1767. The command economy of the Jesuit state collapsed very quickly after the takeover of Spanish colonial civil authorities. Now, it doesn't tell you why they were expelled. See, you get it? This is a little more whitewashed. It doesn't tell you why they were expelled, but it's a good starter to read. This chapter attempts to go beyond more historical storytelling, although it is a fascinating story, but tries to explicate developments using social science and economic theories. That is, making abstract statements saying why and how phenomena are linked and generating falsifiable propositions. It draws on the part of economics and sociology, taking an assumption of rationality as its dominant paradigm. Call it utility maximization as economists do, exchange theory or sociologists, or as sociologists do, or rational choice theory. Throughout the chapter, it is assumed that observed choices are the outcome of weighing perceived anticipated costs and benefits of actions and then seeking to act so as to maximize net benefits. The rise and fall of the Jesuit state saw many players: the Jesuits, the indigenous people, the Spanish colonialists, the Spanish crown, and its internal and external rivals, and the church. Lots of intrigue if this is just an order of priests. All these players pursued their self-interest as they perceived it with the information they had available and subject to the constraints and uncertainties of the day. For example, the endeavor of the Jesuits is neither the result of religious fanaticism nor of irrationality, but may well be explained by concepts from the economics of religion or public economics. The Guarani Indians were not as primitive and naive as some historians want us to believe, but knew how to serve their own interests, despite their disadvantage in violence potential. Spanish colonialists acted as rent seekers in an environment with scarce labor and abundant land, and the crown wanted to claim its share by regularly adapting institutions. In all this South American turmoil, complicated by European wars of succession, wars of religion, heresy, and rising nationalism, the Catholic Church tried to impose its morality and maintain its positions of religious, moral, and worldly power. Lots of conflicting interests, and of course all of these eventually have to be subjugated to one system, because Satan gave his throne and power to the papal institution. The history of the Jesuit missions in Paraguay from 1607 to 1767 is the subject of many books. In the mid-1980s, it was made famous by Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons in Roland Joffe's prize-winning movie The Mission, which, by the way, was very whitewashed, as you can probably already assume. Some of the early literature is contemporaneous and mostly written by Jesuits. Perhaps the most extensive and scientific study is Charlevoix's Charlevoix's 6-volume work from 1757, Histoire du Paraguay. A similar work is by Muratori in 1757 and Dobritzhofer in 1822. 19th as well as 20th century historians have written on the subject, and it cites you there. Some economists have written on it. A lot of this literature is unashamedly biased. It is either apologetic, focusing on the positive aspects of the missions, or on the heroic efforts of the Jesuits. Other historical accounts are outright hostile to the Jesuits. Even today, the historic enmity between Jesuits and Franciscans can get the better of some scholars, and so on. So that's it for this one. There's a few more that we're going to look at and put it all together. Now, this is, what page is this? Page 173, 174 of Footprints of the Jesuits by Thompson Richard. This was written in the 1894. Now, let's see from where we're going to read this thing. This is teeny tiny, and we're going to try to get a little better view here. Okay, it says here we go. The government established. This is on page 173. The government established by them in Paraguay, the Jesuits, was essentially monarchical. It could not have been otherwise under the principles of their constitution. And remember, they had a secret constitution. Moneta secreta. Under the false name of the Christian Republic, it was, all intents and purposes, a theocratic state, so constructed as to free it from all European influences except such as emanated from their superior at Rome. Now, does this sound like something today that you have? I.e. the Vatican, that is sovereign and nobody can tell the Vatican what to do? Exactly. All the intercourse they had with the Church and the Pope was through him, and whatsoever commands he gave were uninquiringly obeyed by them, without stopping to investigate or concern themselves in the least to know whether the Church and the Pope approved or disapproved them. In order to impress the natives with the idea of their independence, of their superiority over the monastic orders and the church ecclesiastes, they practiced the most artful means to persuade them to hold no intercourse with what? With either Spaniards or Portuguese, upon the ground that they could not do so without encountering the example of their vices and immoralities. So again, in other words, the Jesuits were manipulating the Indians, saying, no, you talk to us. We're going to be your intercessors. You don't talk to other people. Mind control. The unsuspecting Indians were easily seduced by acts of kindness, and the result was that in the course of a brief period, they succeeded in establishing a number of what were called reductions, or more properly speaking, villages with multitudes of Indians assembled about them, the whole aggregating in the end several 100,000. These constituted the Jesuit state, and were all, by their mere ceremony of baptism, brought under Jesuit dominion. At each reduction, the natives were allowed to select a secular magistracy, which, with limited and unimportant powers over such temporal affairs as could be entrusted to them without impairing the theocratic feature of the government. In other words, you guys can have your own, administrators, but they're not really going to be meaningful. Does that sound like anything to you today? But in order to provide against the possibility of permitting even these few temporal affairs from being conducted independently of them, they adopted the precaution of providing that, before any important decisions were carried into effect, they should obtain their sanction as spiritual shepherds. In other words, come to us for the final approval. There never was anywhere a more thorough and complete blending of church and state together. Yeah, and if you understand that, you understand the direction that we're going with all this. Communism is just designed to move you to the ultimate communism, which is Catholic communism. Okay, that's for that one. This next one is History of the Jesuits, Their Origin, Progress, and Doctrines and Designs by Niccolini and Giovanni Battista Niccolini. And what year was it? 1854. And this is page 302 through 305. And we're going to zoom in just a little bit to get some better reading. I know you probably can't tell, but just pretend you can tell. Okay. So this is going to be, these villages were known. This is again page 302. We're going to read to about 305. These villages were known under the general appellation of reductions, but each of them was distinguished by a proper name. The first, which was established, was dedicated to the Madonna of Loreto. The second to Ignatius, and others to other saints and Madonnas. As early as the year 1632, the Jesuits possessed 20 reductions, each containing 1,000 families. 2 Jesuits, the curate and the vicar, were appointed to the management of each reduction. which they governed with absolute and unquestioned authority. They were the sovereigns, the friends, the physicians, the gods of those barbarians who consented to live in the reductions. They partook of their labors, of their amusements, of their joys, of their sorrows. They visited daily every house in which lay a sick person, whom they served as the kindest nurse, to whom they seemed to be ministering genii. By such conduct they brought this primitive population to idolize them. It must not be supposed, however, that the Jesuits obtained at once over the ferocious adult Indians a general and absolute power. Even those who had consented to receive baptism and to live for some time in the reduction often deserted it, and disdaining to live that peaceful and comparatively effeminate life, returned to their forests and to their former life of constant warfare in search of their enemies in order to gratify their cannibal appetites. Often they rebelled against the Jesuits' authority, and not seldom menaced them with utter destruction. But the second generation, those children who were born within the reduction, pay attention now, and had been brought up by the fathers, i.e. the Jesuits, showed themselves the most submissive and devoted of all subjects. The Jesuits know that it takes a couple generations for things to click. Gratitude for the kindness they had experienced, admiration for the superior intelligence and acquirements of their masters, awe for the religion they were taught, fear of the punishment and disgrace, all combined to render them faithful and submissive to the fathers. When once the Jesuits had raised up a generation so devoted and obedient, they then brought it into operation of their system of government, and made a successful attempt to realize that republic preconceived of old by Plato, and which, perhaps more interested views, is held out to us by the socialists of our own day. Now remember, this is another can of worms, but like I said, there was so many occultists that you could spend all day covering this stuff. Plato and Pythagoras had a lot of things that he did that were very communistic in nation. He had basically people had no property, everybody had to share everything. I've talked about him in my heliocentric conspiracy series because Pythagoras was necessary for that particular series. It wasn't necessary here necessarily, but it's important to understand again that there's nothing new under the sun. Remember that the devil threads every thread that he ever created back into the Catholic Church. The Jesuits are down the line of history. There's many things that came before them. Pythagoras, Plato's Republic, all of these things were threaded into the Catholic Church. However, it's important to realize that the Catholic Church, the reason these things are threaded into the Catholic Church is because why? Because the devil gave his throne and power to the papal institution so he could be worshipped. Therefore, he needs to thread everything as basically a tool, as a dialectic, to accomplish that outcome of being worshipped through the Pope. Do you understand? Plato's Republic and Pythagoras, those things are deceptions. Those are deceptions the devil created to destroy people. And once the cross was basically done and Christ was revealed and the devil was kicked out, now we have to integrate everything and bring it all into one ideal. Well, let's see, what can I use this for? Well, I'll use it to do that. I'll use that for that. That's what was going on in the devil's mind. And of course, these things are very old. Plato, Pythagoras, if you've looked into these people, you realize that ideas of communistic origin are very, very, very old. So this is not necessarily saying that the Jesuits are the originators of such ideas, but they're the originators of communism as it is today, because they weaponize these older philosophies, nothing new under the sun, in the service of bringing about a totalitarian Catholic empire. So keep that in mind. A little bit of a tangent there, but moving on. In fact, their form of a republic was nothing else than that communism which the famous Cabet is now trying to establish in nearly the same regions. The only difference being that the Jesuits substituted themselves for the state or community. That's right. It was a theocratic communism, if you can imagine such a thing. The most perfect equality reigned in the reductions. No mark of distinction, no difference of dress, of house accommodation, or of food rendered one envious of another person. In every reduction there were workshops in which were exercised the most useful arts. The moment the boys were able to work, they were sent to learn the trade to which they felt most strongly inclined. According to a principle to which the Jesuits invariably adhered, quote, that the art must be guided by nature. The Jesuit lay brothers, or temporal coadjutors, were the artisans who instructed the youth, and they had the professed members themselves put their hand on the plow to encourage the Indians in conquering their repugnance to labor the soil. Every family was assigned a portion of ground which they were obligated to cultivate, and a severe vigilance ensured a good cultivation. The women also had their occupations. Every Monday morning, they received a certain quantity of wool or cotton, and every Saturday they were required to bring it back ready for the loom. All the produce of whatever sort was deposited in large storehouses and distributed by the Jesuits in equal portions to every individual. Even meat was portioned from the public slaughterhouses in the same manner. In the distribution, the greatest attention was paid to the orphan, the helpless, and the superannuated, whatever that is. The surplus of the produce was exported and partly exchanged for European wares which were wanted in the reduction, and the remainder, after having paid a piastra, 4 shillings, for each individual from 18 to 50 years of age, as a sort of tribute to the King of Spain, remained at the disposal of the Jesuits. No coin of whatever sort was permitted or known at the reduction. No currency. A spot of ground attached to every house may be said to have constituted the only property belonging to the individual. And this was done to encourage and recompense industry, for if he made it productive, he reaped all the profits himself, without diminishing the portion he received from the common store. The daily occupations were minutely regulated. There were fixed hours for work, for amusement, for prayers, and an hour was even fixed in the evening after which every person was obligated to return within the wall of his own habitation. Curfews. Any transgression of any of the established rules met with public corporal punishment. But in general, the transgressor feared more the anger of the Father than the castigation that awaited him. General suffrage was exercised in its fullest extent, and it was the people who elected their magistrates and their civil military officers. Remember, those offices didn't really do anything, though. All these public functions were invariably chosen from the Indians, but to flatter the pride or lull the jealousy of the Spanish king, they were distinguished by the Spanish appellations, corregidor, alcalde, and so on. The choice of the people was submitted pro forma, at least, to the approval of the Spanish authorities, who, not knowing either electors or candidates, could not but approve of it, but in reality the sanction of the Jesuits was indispensable to the validity of the election. Just like we have today. You think you're electing somebody, but really they are selected. To keep these people in such a state of dependence and submission, the Jesuits had secluded them from the rest of the world. No individual could leave the reduction without permission, and no European was allowed to visit these reductions unaccompanied, or to have free intercourse with the inhabitants. The knowledge of any other than the native language was altogether banished, and aversion and prejudices against the Europeans as carefully cherished as in ancient Egypt. Nor were the reductions left unprotected against all the possible attacks of foreign enemies. All able-bodied men were drilled to arms and formed into a militia, having its regulations, its officers, its arsenal, its artillery, and its ammunitions. The officers were chosen by the soldiers, the arms and ammunition, not excepting the cannon, were manufactured in the reduction, always by and under the direction of the Jesuits. On the afternoon of every Sunday and after the other holidays, the militia assembled and executed military exercises and evolutions. When that militia was called forth for the service of the Spanish king, quote, they had always at their head and among their ranks Jesuits who prevented all contact with other Indians or with other Europeans, and who answered for their virtue before God as the Indians answered for their courage before men. Nor indeed did they fail in their duty when an occasion presented itself. Tribes of savages often attacked the reductions, but were met with undoubted courage and, generally speaking, were repulsed after sustaining severe loss. So, of course, the snake has to defend its turf. So when people say, oh, they were defending the Guarani Indians, no, they were defending their investment. So don't give them more credit than credit is due. This is from, full text of Hector Macpherson, The Jesuits in History. And in this regard, I think that's what we were going in regard. Let's see which one. There we go. Highlighted a section here. This is on page 38 through 42. The Jesuits in History by Hector Macpherson. We'll read a little bit of it here. In regard to their trade activities in Central America, Palafox, the Archbishop of Mexico, in a report to Pope Innocent X, said, quote, I find almost the whole wealth of Central America in the hands of the Jesuits. and the property they hold in the hands of the cattle and the sheep is something truly enormous. Thus I am acquainted with 2 of their colleges, each of which number 300,000 sheep, and another command more than 60,000 oxen in their pasturages, whilst the secular clergy, together with all of the other religious orders, have only their sugar refineries, and these are very small. The Jesuits possess in the province of Mexico alone, in which they have no fewer than 10 colleges, the 6 largest manufactories that are throughout the whole of Central America, and each of them represents a value from half to a whole $1 million. Some very rich silver mines belong to the colleges, and they have succeeded in a word to bring to such height their power and riches that the secular clergy will soon be compelled to beg their bread from the Jesuits. In order to fully realize the pernicious influence of Romanism on individual and social development, it is necessary to study the case of Paraguay, where for a long period the Jesuits ruled with despotic sway. From the year 1586, when they entered Paraguay, till 1602, the Jesuits labored simply as missionaries. In that year, the Jesuits aspired to be something more than simple missionaries. They began to entertain the idea of creating Paraguay a Roman Catholic state, with the Jesuit general as absolute monarch. By a system of despotism which was conducive to social peace and a certain amount of social prosperity, the natives were kept in a state of tutelage which was admirably calculated to promote spiritual serfdom. The Indians were kept in a condition of mental blindness, and their religion consisted in the grossest superstitions. The Jesuits elevated themselves to a superhuman pinnacle. The natives were being taught to regard them as superior beings from whom they were compelled to receive orders in a kneeling posture, and to kiss the sleeves or the hem of the Holy Father's garments was to be held in high honor. Means were taken to keep the natives in a state of spiritual degradation. To this end, the churches were ornamented with pictures of the most extraordinary description, and with hideous statues furnished with movable limbs and rolling eyes that filled the Indians with mortal terror. It was not the intention of the Jesuits to train the Indians in self-reliance. They were treated as children in secular as well as sacred matters. Every day the produce of their labor was delivered to the Jesuits, and in return the natives received sufficient supply for their daily needs. In Paraguay and as elsewhere, the Jesuits combined missionary enterprise and commercial pursuit. That the Jesuits amassed great wealth in Paraguay is clear from an official Portuguese report written in 1731. The profit, it is said, amounted to over 4 million of ducats annually, which is an enormous amount in today's money. The Jesuits did a particularly lucrative trade in the so-called Paraguay herb. The profit in that famous herb was said to be as great as that of the gold and silver mines in other parts of America. According to the official report as summarized in Dr. Griesinger's book on the Jesuits were enabled to export yearly to Spain about 300,000 hides of cattle, each of which was sold for 6 piastres or more, and the trade in leather brought in even as much. The fields proved to be very productive, and all kinds of grain were grown upon them, as well as especially tobacco, sugar, and cotton, which latter the Indian women were required to spin and weave. All these articles were likewise transported to Europe, and cotton stuffs alone yielded an annual profit of 100,000 heavy piastres. Everywhere were to be observed well appointed workshops, and the Indians manufactured therein most beautiful gold and silver wares. Moreover, there were numbers of locksmiths' shops and forges, and foundries even were not wanting, in which cannon, mortars, and the like might be cast. Remember, they made their own cannons and guns and everything too to defend. They had the Indians do it to defend their turf. However, the latter manufacturers were designed not so much for trade as for internal use, and the same remark also holds good as to the manufacturers of arms. In short, the Jesuits derived from their trade in Paraguay truly immense sums, and these were dutifully taken into keeping by the superiors of the missions. With their proverbial astuteness, the Jesuits contrived to keep their operations in Paraguay concealed from Europe. In the year 1750, the gigantic schemes of the Jesuits came to the knowledge of Spain and Portugal. They thought they were just there doing missions and converting these people to Catholicism. They didn't realize the Jesuits had set up an entire, Jesuit state. Both of these powers having interest in the region of Paraguay could not possibly tolerate the existence of a Jesuit state within their territories. The Jesuits, who had created a considerable military force, made a show of resistance, but the superior power of Spain and Portugal compelled submission. In 1768, Jesuit rule in Paraguay came to an end. The empire built upon the ignorance of the superstition of the Indians was dissolved. So they had some, infighting, but of course you can't beat the Spanish Armada and the Portuguese, so they were eventually kicked out of Spain and so on. Very interesting history. This is another one, Juan de Palafox de Mendoza. This is the guy who wrote that letter to Pope, was it Innocent X or whatever. This is what Wikipedia has to say about him. Jesuits controversy and recall. He was embroiled in a major controversy with the Jesuits over ecclesiastical jurisdiction that eventually cost him his post at Bishop of Puebla de Los Angeles. The Spanish crown was moving to displace mendicant orders from their populous and lucrative doctrinas in central Mexico and replace them with parishes staffed by secular clergy and benefices rather than mendicants. He was largely successful in doing so in Puebla. He then targeted the Jesuits as another entity that did not respect ecclesiastical jurisdiction by paying tithes, essentially a 10% tax on agricultural production to the church hierarchy. In the 1640s, when he took on the Jesuits, Palafox pointed out that the Jesuit order was a hugely wealthy landowner in New Spain, as you saw from that letter. Jesuits claimed that the income from their haciendas went exclusively towards support of their educational institutions and their missionary work on the colonial frontiers. Really quick pause. Do you understand now this network? When we get to Satan's network on earth, do you understand how these collegias, these colleges and universities are actually headquarters? So when people say Georgetown University, which is a Jesuit university, the first university in the United States, it's a Jesuit headquarters, so they can have people there. Do you understand how that works? Same thing, this is nothing you understand. They've been practicing the system for a long time. Moving on. In principle, Palafox asserted that it was a spiritual duty of all to pay the tithe, which the Jesuits steadfastly refused to do. The tithe transferred wealth from the countryside's landed estates to cities and towns, supporting the cathedral chapter, parish priests, and charitable institutions. Obviously, as a powerful bishop, Palafox would have been interested in increasing the revenue from Jesuit tithes, but also in asserting episcopal authority over that order. In 1647, the Diocese of Puebla ordered all Jesuits to produce licenses from the diocese to preach and hear confession, something that was required under canon law and empowered bishops. The Jesuits asserted they needed no such licenses, and so they could exercise such powers without special permission of a bishop. Palafox wrote that if this were true, that the bishop had no power in his own diocese and he would be separated from his own flock by an alien authority. The Jesuits found an ally against Palafox in the new Viceroy Garcia Sarmiento de Sotomayor, second Count of Salvatierra. Salvatierra sought to arrest Palafox in 1647 rather than be arrested, which might have produced an uprising in Puebla against the Viceroy's abuse of authority. Palafox fled to the mountains outside the city. The move was calculated to show the crown that the situation in New Spain was grave, and the Viceroy and the Jesuits were challenging the rightful place of episcopal authority. In that he failed and was ultimately humiliated by being recalled to Spain. Palafox laid formal complaints against the Jesuits at Rome. The Pope, however, refused to approve his censures, and all he could obtain was a brief from Pope Innocent X in 1648, commanding the Jesuits to respect the episcopal jurisdiction. Yeah, right. On 20th May 1655, Palafox and the Jesuits signed an accord, but disagreements continued. In the same year, the Jesuits succeeded in securing his transfer to the See of Osma and Old Castile. Although Palafox's ecclesiastical career went into an eclipse, his writings against the Jesuits were subsequently published in France and in the 18th century. His writings were used to strengthen the case for regalist authority, resulting in the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spain in 1767. Some of Palafox's influential anti-Jesuit writings deal with the Chinese rites controversy. Palafox had jurisdiction as a bishop on certain Asian missions, but according to Costa Rican scholar Ricardo Martinez Esquivel, the main reason he declared the Jesuits' tolerance for traditional ancestor worship practices among Chinese converts to Christianity as heretic was his personal conflict with the Jesuits. So Palafox was quite embroiled with the Jesuits. Obviously, I'm not saying Palafox is a hero, but you can document these things as proof of the Jesuits' abuses. They were making tons and tons of money. Number one, they refused to tithe and be part of the system, which shows you this is a renegade order, a secret society of sorts. So they have their own constitution. They want to have their own state. They're acting independently, just like the Art of War tells you. And of course, they're saying one thing and doing another. Oh, we're there to evangelize these people and to Christianize them. And of course, what are they doing? They're making a theocratic state where they could basically profit and raising their own army. And even probably if somehow they had raised these people to be stronger than the Spanish Armada, let's say, which of course wasn't meant to be. But if it had been, they would have taken out the Spaniards and become their own empire at that time. Do you understand? So this is the point. I mean, if you study these things, you can get a very in-depth view of history. This is from jamesjapan.net, and the article is titled "The True Authors of Communism, Socialism, which is the Jesuits." Got a diagram here of the Hegelian dialectic, and let's read. This is without a doubt the clearest explanation I have ever come across about the historical origins of communism, socialism, and who formulates its ideology. I believe this article is from, who wrote the original article? This article is an excerpt from Walt Stickle's website, The Root of Communism, the Jesuits. So you can look that up. I tried to go to the website. It seems like it was not working as well. But anyway, this is part of the article. To understand the Hegelian dialectic of character of Jesuitical deception, we must consider the doctrines of communism were designed by the Jesuits through what were known as the Reductions in Paraguay in the 17th and 18th centuries, which were a series of communes in which Jesuit priests exercised authority over the natives there. In that environment, the Jesuit order maintained control over a group of South American Guarani Indians, who they educated and trained to work on their behalf, generating goods that were later sold in the markets of Europe. From a 1933 book titled The Revolutionary Movement by J. Findlater, we read the following. Quote, "The Jesuits had established 20 strong mission centers called Reductions with many thousands of Guaranis enrolled as their members. The Jesuits aimed to set up a completely communistic system in the sense that no individual rights were recognized and there was no private property. Everything belonged to the state and was supposed to be shared in common. But in reality, the greater part of the proceeds of the goods sold was always remitted to the Camarilla, Jesuit superiors, in Europe, and the Guaranis got only the bare necessities of life in return for their toil and sweat. The Jesuit leaders provided the necessary food, clothing, and health care that the Indians needed, while using them as worker bees to generate income for the order. Just as the Soviet Union would do in the 20th century, the Jesuits maintained strict control over the activities of their subjects." Quote, "Neither would they allow any Guarani to learn Spanish, nor would they tolerate any intercourse between Guaranis and the peoples of the surrounding Spanish colonies, a prohibition maintained at the sword's point." So they kept them isolated. This is what cults do, right? You keep your people isolated so they don't learn anything, so they can be completely programmed. They perfected their system of totalitarian control, all the while telling the world that their oppression over the peoples was in fact a utopia, which is what you'll find most of the mainstream narrative. Oh, they helped civilize these people and they gave them so many benefits and so on. A deluded fantasy maintained by some Catholic historians to this day. Perhaps worst of all is that the Jesuit did not present any form of the gospel or what might be called the Christian faith to these poor Indians. That is the worst of all, folks. This is the worst of all. Quote, "There is no evidence that any effort was ever made by the Jesuits to impart the truths, properly so-called, of the Christian religion. When the Jesuits were expelled, the Guaranis, having had no moral or religious training to fit them to continue in the Christian faith, in a few years became as if no religious teachers had ever lived and worked among them." So sad. That, to me, is the saddest part of this. The ideas the Jesuits developed in Paraguay over a period of 158 years were then communicated to Karl Marx in the 19th century. Quote, "For 5 years, Karl Marx went to Jesuit school in Trier, which during the Prussian period was known as the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium." So Karl Marx was a Jesuit operative. Along with Karl Marx, other leading communists like Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro were also trained by the Jesuits. In fact, the former Jesuit general, Pedro Arrupe, once boasted the following, "And what makes you think we are not proud of Fidel Castro?" While it is true that the popes are known for condemning communism, this on their part seems to be more political manipulation than anything else. Remember, a really quick pause, just like how they were condemning Zionism, how the Pope, Pius X or whatever he was like, oh, we are not going to give Jerusalem to the Jews. Meanwhile, the Jesuits are working their Zionistic agenda in the background. So these are just theater, folks. It's just theater, one Jesuit theater after another. Since Rome has repeatedly supported the principles of communist thought. Exactly. The Communist Manifesto was first published in 1848, and within less than 50 years, we find the Vatican publishing declarations in agreement with it. Rerum Novarum, I believe, is the document. In his book Ecclesiastical Megalomania, author John W. Robbins notes the following. One of the Roman Church's most influential statements on economic matters is the 1891 cyclical Rerum Novarum on the condition of the working classes. This encyclical, the Roman Church state allied herself with the proletariat, which in Marxism is the greatest and final enemy of the capitalist order. The encyclical's Marxism is so blatant that one Roman Catholic writer declared that much of the encyclical, Rerum Novarum, appeared only to repeat in more orthodox language what Marx had said 10 years before. Indeed, there are paragraphs, if not pages, in the Communist Manifesto that might have been written by the Pope. Then, incredibly, after about 100 years of various papal diatribes against communism in all its forms, the Sunday Times of London reported that, quote, Karl Marx, who famously described religion as the opium of the people, has joined Galileo, Charles Darwin, and Oscar Wilde on a growing list of historical figures to have undergone an unlikely reappraisal by the Roman Catholic Church. The article goes on to quote George Sands, a professor of the Vatican's Gregorian University, who, with the utmost subtlety, speaks about Marxism in a way that seems carefully designed to undermine capitalism and promote the communist principles that Rome has always aligned herself with. Any study of the papal influence in world governments will prove that capitalism, which is the promotion of free enterprise, is the very antithesis of official Roman Catholic dogma. And you will learn this, my friends, in the next section when we look at the false prophet and the subjugation of the United States, how it is impossible to be completely hardcore Catholic and in alignment with the principles of the United States. It's not possible. It's not possible. And you'll learn why. Because of these things, we cannot help but consider the possibility that the real purpose of the McCarthy era was to manipulate the American mentality with Hegelian dialectics, intended to take the anti-communist fury to such an extreme that it would become offensive to the American people. Bait you one direction so you go the other. McCarthy's methods were so unreasonable that the idea of condemning someone for being a communist was collectively shunned. If we consider the growing influence of communism today, we can only wonder if McCarthyism had been part of the Jesuits' greater plan all along. Condition the people to despise anti-communist witch hunting, then use their desire for toleration as an open door to usher in a more moderate version of it, i.e. socialism, later on. Such tactics would be impossible to believe, except for the fact that we find Rome on both sides of the issue. And as you'll see, we'll cover a little bit of, I think I have some stuff on World War II on this section. They played both sides, folks. They always play both sides. It's always that way. Here's one more article, then we'll wrap it up. This is The Origins of Social Justice, Tapparelli di Azeglio, October 8th, 2014. What are the origins of social justice, I wonder? Let's see. Will we find a Jesuit there somewhere if we sniff around deep enough? Originally, when the idea of social justice was first developed in the 1840s, it was a formal concept rather than a material one. By this I mean that the term was taken to signify simply a branch of the ordinary concept of justice, analogous to cumulative justice or criminal justice, and did not simply imply any particular content, philosophy, or view of the world. There could be and was a conservative conception of social justice, a liberal conception of it, and a socialist conception of it, all equally entitled to call themselves social justice. In other words, the concept of social justice was initially an extension of the existing traditional idea of justice into a new area, that of society as a whole, so that it did not require developing any content new to the idea, but just new conditions for its application. This is what we find with the earliest users of the idea: Luigi Tapparelli di Azeglio, the conservative, who inaugurated it; Antonio Rosmini, the classical liberal who publicized it; and the English Christian socialists. Since the Second World War, however, social justice has come to mean something very different. The socialist conception of it won out over its rivals and gained solitary possession of the field. The term now stands for a very particular view of what is right and wrong in society. It has become a material concept rather than a formal one. My aim in these pages is to begin to describe the process by which the concept itself originally came about. First, it will be helpful to say something about the historical circumstances out of which it arose. Social justice owes its origin as a distinct concept to the Italian Risorgimento of the 19th century. It was first used, to our knowledge, by the Jesuit philosopher Luigi Tapparelli di Azeglio in 1843, in the debates over the beginnings of the Risorgimento's effort to unify the Italian peninsula politically. So Mussolini, who came 100 years later, they've been working on him for a while, just like they work on everything else. So around the time of the Communist Manifesto, right after the socialist reductions, communist reductions really, in Paraguay and South America, what do you have? You have the first mention of it by a Jesuit philosopher, social justice. What's this new idea? That's interesting. Today we take these things for granted because we grow up with them, but you have to understand that at the time, This is a new idea, and pushing things in a different direction is setting the stage for the communistic paradigm. These things don't happen overnight, folks. Certainly not back then when they didn't have social media and all this control over the echo chamber to change reality so quickly. They had to do things very slowly and carefully. So they start with this, they push it here, and then they push it there, and they push a little bit here, and they push a little there. And stronger pushes, and eventually you get there. But you don't get that unless you analyze history and you look at history. So the first person to suggest this was a Jesuit philosopher. Right around the time that Karl Marx wrote his particular manifesto, quote-unquote manifesto. So conclusion from all this stuff, there's still much more to cover, but the Spanish conquered Latin America, and the Jesuits quickly set up theocracies that worked as basically little communist states and profited off the natives. That is the ugly history of South America. The Jesuits were seen as demigods by these people, and of course they distributed rations to everybody. They kept all the produce, and they gave them material benefits, but these things were like very minimal, just to keep you content. And of course, there was a lot of gaslighting and cult-like mental manipulation to keep them in line. You saw that eventually the generations that started to grow up in these things were totally allegiant to the Jesuits. It was Catholic communism, and they did it for a little over 150 years. They made tons of money, probably billions, maybe even more, who knows, but probably billions in today's money. And of course, that's very well documented. And when they started getting banned from countries for basically fomenting revolutions and having intrigues, and people realized, like, whoa, the Jesuits have their own empire in South America. Whoa, we can't have that. The Pope basically agreed to the pressure of the monarchs and caved to all the monarchs saying, hey, you need to disband this order. They're taking over. The Pope agreed. Pope Clement the 15th or 5th or some number after that. I always forget the Roman numerals, but Pope Clement. And he was arrested, assassinated, and this was the inflection point, the French Revolution. The French Revolution was caused because the Jesuits had been foiled by their reductions. Do you get it? The reductions were like the first attempt at a Jesuit takeover, a Jesuit state, an empire, a communist Jesuit empire. Those got exposed. Eventually, you saw people like Palafox, other people say, hey, these guys are getting wealthy, they're getting rich. Like, what are they doing over here? You're not paying tithes. They got their own state. They're not just doing missions. So, of course, they eventually got banned. And, of course, that was the catalyst for the French Revolution. To be like, you know what? We're done with these monarchs. Monarchy is too much of a problem for the Jesuits. Because monarchy, first off, changes things very slowly. You have a monarch who lives, sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe even longer. And monarchs are one person. They're harder to control. In other words, if that person disagrees with you, then that's it. But if you have a two-party system, do you get it? If you have a two-party system, it's much easier to control reality and still give people the illusion that they're participating in this system. Whereas a monarchy, it's just what the monarch says, and you can revolt against the monarch. So that's a real problem. It's a very rigid system. But if you have this two-party system, then you can always make it seem like there's this, oh gosh, we got really close last week. You just got to vote more next time. We got to turn out next time. And it's this constant illusion that you're part of this thing and you're contributing to it, but really it's a delusion. You saw that they were controlling elections in the reductions. Do you get it? They were controlling the elections in the reductions. Do you think that changed? Do you think that's changed in the last 300 years or 400 years, whatever it's been? No. They've been controlling elections since the very beginning. The snake is not going to let people come to power that do not espouse the values of the snake. And you will see from America's history, plain example of that, because the people who did not go along with the Jesuits were assassinated. So, very important, you have to understand that all this stuff has been going on for a very long time. Nevertheless, watch my French Revolution episode number 14 in the End Time series. The French Revolution was an inflection point in history. And you have to understand why from a biblical prophetic lens. Because it set the stage for this final system. First off, it ended the 1260-year period of the beast. So it's a definite marker, and now that's in the past. Now we're in the final stretch of history where the beast is resurrecting and going to be worshipped. So that's an important prophetic marker. It also started this two-party system and the dialectic between essentially the left and the right, communism and nationalism, religious nationalism, which is Catholicism. It's the Catholic, pontifex controlling nation states. That is the ultimate goal. And these two things have to oscillate over time and through generations and revolutions and things like this. And we are at the end of this oscillation. That's why you have to understand what happened in the French Revolution and what the context of this inflection point is, to understand what is going on right now with the current revolution, quote unquote, the great awakening that's happening. This is just a staged revolution in the opposite direction. Interestingly enough, the Bible says that the beast that the woman rides in Revelation 17 is the one that kills the two witnesses. That's an interesting connection, because the beast that the woman rides in Revelation 17 comes out of the bottomless pit. We know that the bottomless pit was opened when Muhammad came down, however that figures in, but nevertheless, the bottomless pit was opened. That's what the Bible says. A lot of satanic things came out. Islam was one of them. And the beast that the woman rides in Revelation 17 arises from the bottomless pit and destroys the two witnesses and makes war on them. So that's a really interesting connection, because the image of Revelation 17 is a final picture of this New World Order system, of this union between church and state. And of course, it's also a picture of the mystery religion coming to the forefront and dressing up as a counterfeit bride of Christ. A lot of interesting pictures in that particular vision. And that final picture is what kills the two witnesses. Meaning, why is that very important? Because there's a connection there. The two witnesses, which I talk about in my two witnesses episode, is the Word of God, which also has a 1260-year period and was killed during the French Revolution, where Christianity was banned for 3.5 years, Bibles were burned, and of course, eventually that led to revivals and things like that. But the two witnesses were killed during the French Revolution. If you don't understand how that connects, watch my two witnesses episode. That means that this final system, this final NWO system, the woman riding the beast, the final thing that we see, Mystery Babylon, coming to the forefront, that system emerged from the French Revolution. Do you see the connection? The beast that comes from the bottomless pit kills the two witnesses. So the beast, this final system, has its part to play in the French Revolution. Therefore, the French Revolution, this dialectic of left and right, oppositions to bring about the oscillation to the final capstone, is part of this final system. And of course, we are at the end of that oscillation, with all this Trump, MAGA stuff, and the world flipping to the right and everything else. So, a lot of very critical things about the French Revolution. It was also very, very satanic. If you've read about the French Revolution, you know how just orgies and idolatry and just total satanic rebellion. A lot of satanic themes with false light, Masonic themes. It was just all over the place. It also set the stage for the false prophet, the United States, to emerge and basically bring the world back to the beast. We'll talk about that in the next section. And it brought a lot of mystery religion ideals into the world, like humanism, the Enlightenment, liberalism, and eventually, of course, communism. After the French Revolution, you had a lot of very satanic things that happened and came into the world with a flood. Zionism, these are all in the 1800s. Zionism, white Israelism, black Israelism, evolution, many false prophets like Joseph Smith, Ellen White, Jehovah's Witnesses, countless false teachers like Darby, Scofield, Irving. You had the First World Council of Religions, which was basically to unite all religions into one mentality. That happened in like 1898. Communism, occultism, theosophy, secret societies like Skull and Bones, on and on and on. Smithsonian, Cosmos Club. I talk about some of these in my heliocentric conspiracy. There's so much evil stuff that came out of the 1800s as a result of the French Revolution being the initiation of the world into this dark liberal paradigm. Now, what do you think is happening now? What's happening now is kind of the opposite, in the opposite direction. It's a revolution, but it's opposite towards religion, towards nationalism, towards godly things that look godly, but they're not. That's the opposite of the French Revolution. So you have to understand you're doing the same thing, but in the opposite direction. And if you understand the French Revolution, then you can see where everything's going. Either way, it was a pivotal point historically and prophetically, and you have to understand its significance. Anyway, our focus is on communism. And of course, communism was weaponized to create a precedent for the beast to come back to power. And that's the focus of today. Nevertheless, all these things come together. Alberto Rivera, who was an ex-Jesuit, and you can look into him, he says his testimony is that Marx basically wrote his manifesto in a private reading room in the British Museum where the Jesuits were basically feeding him the info. Now, whether that's true or not, I'll let you decide. We know from all the other things we've covered, and there's still yet a lot more, that there's a lot of reason to suspect that would be true. It would not be a surprise with how you had Rerum Novarum, the similarities between that and the Communist Manifesto. They were like 10 years apart. The fact that the Jesuits practiced communism, the fact that the originator of social justice was a Jesuit, the fact that the Jews are always used by the Jesuits through secret societies for their aims. We know all of these things. Is it a stretch to believe that Karl Marx wrote his manifesto based on things that he was being fed? And you will see, because we have much more to review, how the Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf, was written by a Jesuit priest, and how other places like in Mao Zedong in China, who basically killed millions and millions of people through communism, he was a Jesuit spy. So is it likely that Karl Marx was just another agent? He was just a puppet that gave him what he wanted, and just do this, and he could care less. He's a godless atheist, or maybe he's a secret society member, who knows? But either way, he was a puppet. He was a puppet to be tempted and deceived into destruction. Frederick Engels was a quote-unquote Protestant as well, so you know how that works. When you have people like Adam Weishaupt who have multiple layers of counterfeit faith, that should tell you everything. That should tell you everything. When you see these people's backgrounds, it should tell you everything. Either way, we are coming to the end of the communist experiment. It's coming to an end, folks. It's coming to an end because it's fulfilled its purpose. So now I want to look at a few current examples of Jesuits' involvement in communism in different places. The following list of places we're looking at is not going to be exhaustive by any means, but it is designed to show you that the Jesuits are the ones who developed and implemented revolutions and communist paradigms in multiple places through secret societies, proxies, Jews, whatever else. But it was ultimately Jesuits were connected to these things. So this first one is a special report dated November 27, 1979. It's an EIR. The magazine is called EIR. I forget what that stands for, but either way. The title of the article is The Societas Jesu, 40,000 Agents, the political intelligence outfit of the Pope must clean out. The spectacular assassination of Lord Louis Mountbatten of Burma last summer raised questions which, although still unanswered, suggest that a major portion of responsibility for that assassination ought to be placed on the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. That event, whose investigation continues, is found to correlate with an international strategic mobilization of the Society of Jesus. This has resulted in a massive destabilization of Latin America. Moreover, a similar project is being led by Jesuits in South Korea, featuring the assassination of President Park. The mobilization also encompasses Indochina, the Philippines, India, North Africa, and, through cooperation between the Jesuits and the Muslim Brotherhood, in the Middle East. Secret societies, Synagogue of Satan. Such political circumstances make necessary a detailed review of the entire spectrum of the worldwide activities of the Jesuit order, the Societas Jesu. The following report by EIR, contributing editor Kriton Zoakos, is a summary presentation of the ongoing investigations into this matter. As the report demonstrates, the Societas Jesu today is principally a political intelligence operation. It is controlled and deployed by a coalition of old oligarchical families and circles of Europe. It utilizes its nominal religious status in order to maximize the effectiveness of its operations. As a political intelligence organization, the Society of Jesus enjoys a programmatic convergence and coordination with the British, Chinese, and Israeli intelligence networks. For example, the objective of the current Jesuit mobilization, as with the British, Chinese, and Israeli intelligence networks, is to destabilize all of those regimes in the Third World which might align with the European monetary system for the purpose of industrialization projects that would bring forth, in the 1980s, a system of allied, powerful industrial republics around the world. In other words, a Jesuit, Catholic, communist, New World Order utopia for them. Given the shared objective of preventing the development, it is difficult, even meaningless, to distinguish Jesuits from the British, the Zionists, and so on when it comes to tactical decisions. However, the Society of Jesus is characterized by certain unique features which make it superior in certain respects to its sister British and Israeli organizations. The distinction of the Jesuits is specifically on the epistemological plane. The Jesuits' specific tactical applications use a specific modus operandi which is permeated by this revolution in theology and are conducted through a vast, specifically Jesuit network. Jesuit capabilities. The Societas Jesu, or having its former military title, the Compañía de Jesús, is a rigidly disciplined force of more than 40,000 individuals worldwide, all of whom have gone through the uniquely rigid Jesuit training process. First, they attained a doctoral degree in a pre-assigned area of study. Then they pursued a rigorous 12-year program of Jesuit mortification as laid down by the order's founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola. The entire worldwide organization is structured along strictly military lines under its general, Father Arrupe, with his general staff in the Vatican. Remember, this is from 1979, so Arrupe is not the general anymore, but either way. The general staff is composed of 11 assistants and 4 special assistants who preside over a world map divided into 11 assistancies and 93 provinces or vice provinces in North America, South America, and the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, the Far East, and Europe and Africa. From 1915 to 1942, the Societas Jesu focused on increasing its presence in the United States and in England, with the result that today a full 20 to 25% of all Jesuits in the world operate in the United States. That is another important thing to remember for the next section. The order operates such major U.S. educational institutions as Fordham University, Notre Dame, Loyola University, Georgetown University, St. Joseph's College in Philadelphia, Canisius College in Buffalo, and a string of Ignatius Loyola colleges across the country. Do you remember what those are? Their headquarters, folks. In toto, the society operates dozens of educational institutions throughout the United States, all of which are organized into a sophisticated tracking system of students and graduates whose careers are discreetly followed and shaped by the Societas Jesu. The prize asset of this operation is the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, which maintains by general admission the most powerful single hold over the attitudes, policies, and perspectives of senior and middle-level diplomatic personnel in the United States Foreign Service. On a worldwide scale, the Jesuit order operates a dense network of over 4,000 educational institutions of all types. It edits and publishes over 1,000 periodicals on political, economic, social, philosophical, and other subjects. It maintains control over a great number of radio and television programs throughout the world, especially in the developing sector. Among the most notorious international education institutions of the Societas Jesu is Louvain University in Belgium, which has trained many prominent Latin American politicians from Camilo Torres, the guerrilla priest, to Roger Vecamans, the architect of the Latin American Christian Democratic parties, and the organizer of the Pots and Pans riots in Chile, which brought down the Allende regime. An accounting of Jesuit capabilities is incomplete unless it mentions extensive controls that the order maintains over certain banks and businesses and over international terrorist networks. Jesuit businesses holdings include the Banque Française et Italienne pour l'Amérique du Sud, the Bank of London in the South America, the Bank of Italy in La Plata, certain major real estate, coffee, and sugar companies in Latin America. In a different way, the Society of Jesus can on occasion rely on the resources of the principal Habsburg-controlled Bank of Europe, the Société Générale de Belgique, because of the special controls which the Habsburg family historically maintains over the intelligence apparatus of the Jesuits. Regarding terrorist and assassination capability, most of the Latin American terrorism is either induced or controlled by the Jesuit-spawned liberation theology and the order's specific terrorist projects, such as one led by Father Camilo Torres. Law enforcement agencies know that the entire Basque terrorist organization, the ETA, was created from scratch by 2 Jesuit priests inside a Jesuit seminary in the district of the present general of the society, Father Arrupe, back in 1957. The first task of the Jesuits assigned to the ETA from its inception was the establishment of close military and logistical ties with branches of what later became the Provisional IRA in Catholic Ireland. Recent investigations around the Moro assassination in Italy have revealed direct Jesuit involvement in Italian left and right terrorism through networks involving the Venetian and Roman Circolo Re, the Permendex organization, and the old Italian aristocracy's assets in Costa Rica. Both sides, just like everywhere else. The relations of former CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton with the Venice aristocracy and his close affinity with Count de Raschowitz, Ezra Pound's son-in-law, are not unrelated to the fact that Angleton was also the Vatican intelligence desk chief in the CIA. Finally, enough intelligence data is available to draw the conclusion that the Jones cult massacre last year in Guyana was at test run for another Jesuit capability, that for religious fundamentalist destabilization. It was run and covered by a team of State Department officials, some of whom are graduates of Georgetown University under Secretary of State Warren Christopher, an associate of Jesuit-trained Governor of California Jerry Brown. After the successful conduct of that experiment, the final phase of the Ayatollah Khomeini's fundamentalist operation in Iran was launched. Yeah, and the revolutions right now against Iran, guess who's controlling them? Same thing, dark and light are both sides of the same devil coin, folks. From that point, U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski established regular close liaison with the Jesuit-controlled Justia et Pax Commission in the Vatican, which together with Jesuit operatives in the Pontifical Biblical Institute, which maintains relationship with Israeli intelligence, and the Pontifical Order Oriental Institute, which maintains relations with Chinese intelligence, has been attempting and getting very dangerously close to influencing a new pope relatively unschooled in the Western oligarchy's foreign policy intrigues. The theology. The long-term strategic objectives for which the Jesuits are now deploying worldwide have been presented in the writings and communications of such Jesuits as Karl Rahner, Teilhard de Chardin, and late Carroll Quigley, Dean of History at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In summary, the Jesuits seek a synarchist world order by the year 2000, initiating the era of the Great Stability to be based, number one, on a drastic scaling down of the use of science and technology in the world economy. Number two, on a defeat of the middle class industrial capitalism by a combination of left guild socialism at the bottom and right oligarchical police states at the top. Number three, a general weakening and emasculation of the sovereign powers of the nation state, which is to be replaced by the various one world federalist supranational agencies like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, variants of UNESCO, and so on. During the current Jubilee year of the Church, which lasts from 1975 to 2000, we're coming up on the next Jubilee, a final apocalyptic struggle is going to conclude between mankind and Satan, quote unquote. This is derived from the following Jesuit argument. The definition of Satan and evil is that presented in the Babylonian version of the third book of Genesis, man's temptation to gain knowledge of good and evil. This particular quarter century is critical because man's advances in science and technology have made man arrogant, endowed him with the possibility of establishing complete mastery of natural processes. This arrogance is the Satan that must be defeated. If it is not done during this quarter century, it will then be too late, and the genie will be out of the bottle. Given this task, what alternative social organization must be created to supersede the present world organization, which will be able to stop mankind's march towards scientific and technological progress? Both Teilhard de Chardin and Quigley envisage a supranational system of institutions beyond the United Nations, assuming all of the functions of the existing nation-states. In the current Jesuit strategic perspective, such supranational institutions will derive their executive power by means of secret arrangements among the ruling elites of the United Kingdom, China, Israel, and the disintegrated United States. This new international order is eventually supposed to function in the mode of the Holy Roman Empire from the 12th to the 14th century. For this, French and German nationalism in particular must be dissipated. According to Jesuit strategic thinking, this can only be accomplished within a European community, not of the type prevailing today, but one dominated by policies dictated by England and run as a collection of ethnic regions, Brittany, Bavaria, Basque, so on. This is Otto von Habsburg Europe of the regions, as opposed to the current confederation of nation-states. As such, a project dissipates French and German nationalism. The nationalism of the USA will be crushed through a series of domestic social engineering projects, following up on the results of the 1960s Generation Gap project. Such projects are to include a transformation of the American Constitution, a project in which the Catholics, Ted Kennedy and Jerry Brown, are both participating. It is to include an end to the industrial expansion and reversion to lower forms of energy utilization in the U.S. economy. Finally, the U.S. is to accept that it has now entered a multipolar world in which this nation is no longer a major political factor. Really quick pause. Do you see how this has played out in the narrative? How basically the United States has been weakened, quote unquote weakened, because it's really been all designed. But of course, on the surface, it has been weakened. All of these things have been carried out. Now, the thing is, just like how the reformers did not have historical perspective to understand the fullness of these schemes, because you're not there with the Jesuits, whether planning and scheming these things. Right? We can do a lot of research and find these things out, but history has to reveal their schemes. Do you get it? So the point I'm trying to make is this. Just like how the reformers realized that they were under the beast, and there was the Inquisition, all this stuff going on. They thought that the mark of the beast was being enforced, and this was it. This was it. They were wrong. Of course, they weren't wrong in some sense. They recognized this foreshadowing. There was a satanic thread going on that has gone throughout time of the beast enforcing its power. But it wasn't being fully fulfilled. The mark of the beast was not there yet because the image of the beast hadn't yet been formed, and the mortal wound hadn't been struck. So because they were trapped in time, they didn't have perspective. This article is from 50 years ago almost. And of course, during that time, the agencies of the beast was to really push and destroy America with liberalism. Why? Because America is the false prophet, and America would return to nationalism and as a result create the image of the beast. Do you get it? But that's not obvious from this perspective 50 years ago. So of course, I don't expect them to completely see all of these machinations and what the end is. They see it as, well, the Jesuits are basically trying to create this communist dystopia and destroy everything with liberalism, which is true. They were doing that. But that was by design for the next thing, which of course wasn't obvious 50 years ago. Now it's obvious. Now you see people like Trump and MAGA and all these dialectics and schemes. It's very obvious. Do you see the advantage we have of history? It wasn't obvious 50 years ago. But nevertheless, this is documenting to you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, all of these intrigues and the people behind them and who they actually are. Moving on, we have just a little bit more. For this new international order, the emergence of China in world affairs is also required. Here hangs the secret of the so-called China card. For the Jesuit order, for the British, Dutch, and Belgian monarchies, and for the unrepentant Italian aristocracy, China does not simply represent a major strategic asset for the current world strategic equation against the Soviet Union. China represents a major historical model of how to organize a stable, low-technology, low-industry society organized in a system of local control, guild socialism, and ruled by a synarchist aristocratic mandarinate at the top. This is the secret upon which various well-known intelligence services have engineered, promoted, or tolerated the various Maoist movements in the advancement sector of the Third World from the 1950s onward. Yeah, you'll see, we're going to cover China. You will see the Jesuits propped up Mao. And of course, China is like a reduction. China is like a giant reduction for them, to where they can practice all this New World Order stuff and get away with tracking people with AI, facial recognition, social credit score, all the things that are eventually coming to you under the guise of freedom cities, and we got to make sure we have voting ID and all this stuff. All the things that will be repackaged and given to you are being trialed. Do you understand the pattern? Just like they trial run communism in the reductions in South America for 160 years, and then, okay, time to export it to the world. They're the same doing with China. Of course, things are moving faster and faster now because of technology, but they're the same thing. China is a trial run for what's coming to the world. It's not just something that happened, because China also has a very underground Catholic church that's being poised for a resurrection there. So very, very interesting things in China. But anyway, one more paragraph. As Zoakos reports proves, Jesuit organizing of Jacobin mobs at the base is always coupled with controls at the top of the local social pyramids, affording the top executives of the Jesuit order a virtually unparalleled capability for large-scale social manipulations. It is this character of Jesuit deployment which creates for the outsider the optical illusion that the Societas Jesu is split into left and right tendencies. But individual Jesuit operatives, including those who publicly switch from left to right and vice versa, are able to maintain their self-consistency and their effectiveness because to them, their principal strategic perspective for which they undergo lifelong training is the destruction of technology-oriented industrial capitalist formations throughout the world. Whether you're playing on the left or on the right, your goal is still the same, folks. Your goal is to bring the beast to be worshipped. That's their goal. So these people play on the left, play on the right. They have secret society members that play on the left, play on the right. People switch. This is what happens. And you're going to see examples when we go to current events. People switch from dark to light. Okay, if you don't want to switch this new thing and continue in the old thing, then you're going to be exposed because everybody's blackmailed. It's one big satanic matrix. Now, one more here. This is also, again, from 1979, but this is a continuation of that article. It's Jesuit Role Exposed in Third World Affairs. This one's by Kriton Zoakos, contributing editor. For over 4 centuries, the Jesuit order has been systematically deployed by an international political faction whose memories and interests go way beyond the day on which Ignatius Loyola, a Spanish military adventurer in the pay of the Habsburg family, founded the order. That political faction is the ancient core of the European nobility, the Pallavicini, the Sursocs, the Colonnas, the Habsburg, the Cecils, and others, who trace their family lineage to the gens Julia of Julius Caesar, to the Aeneas of defeated Troy, or to the archpriests of the Isis cult in ancient Egypt. It's one big club. That political faction maintains power over a major part of the world's international financial institutions, a powerful grip over key raw materials, holdings, and strategic control over numerous governments, such as the Belgian and Dutch thrones, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, key institutions of the Swiss government, most institutions of the British government, and international institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, which was started by Jesuits, I believe, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, the United Nations Committee on Trade and Development, and the World Council of Churches, which, by the way, is doing a lot of ecumenical things. I think their rate for meeting together in these ecumenical meetings has gone from like every 10 years or something to now it's like every 2 years or something. So just tells you again, the things are ramping up. We don't have too much time. The effectiveness of the Jesuit deployments therefore derives not merely from the fact that the society itself has its own formidable capabilities, but from the fact that it deploys centrally as a political intelligence unit of a machine much larger than itself. Jesuit programmatic perspective: destroy the nation state. The Society of Jesus was founded by the ancient European oligarchy as a new instrument for the implementation of their historical objective of eliminating from the face of the earth the Neoplatonic institution of the nation state in either its republican or monarchical form. It is not accidental that England's Cecil family, the Earls of Salisbury, are principally responsible for the creation of the League of Nations, and later the United Nations, which they envisaged as the instrumentalities which would gradually, through a long-term program of attrition, absorb most of the fundamental sovereign prerogatives of the nation-states and finally leave them empty shells to be ruled by faceless global planetary institutions in the hands of the oligarchy, in the style of the Holy Roman Empire, as Jesuit historian Carroll Quigley expressed it. The Cecil family has been identified as the Anglican Jesuits par excellence. Only a few decades after its founding, the Society of Jesus succeeded in launching two basic types of social control techniques which defined European politics and history in the 17th and 18th centuries, and in renewed form in the 19th and 20th centuries in a different way. These two basic techniques are intellectual projection movements and left-wing Jacobinism. The relative effectiveness of the intellectual projection movement technique of the Jesuits can be viewed by examining the truth behind the so-called Enlightenment period of European history. The entirety of the Enlightenment was a Jesuit creation from beginning to end. Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau, atheist Voltaire, and even René Descartes were trained and launched by the Jesuits. Descartes was most likely assassinated by the Jesuits, as Voltaire insinuates, because he had broken out of their control, despite the campaign of intimidation launched by his friend, the Jesuit agent Marcin. The Society of Jesus launched the Enlightenment in order to extirpate the enormous scientific and intellectual influence of Europe's Neoplatonic elite, which, having launched the Italian and Tudor Renaissances, having formed the nation-state of France under Spider King Louis XI, was threatening to establish permanent world hegemony under the guidance of the Neoplatonic church networks led by Erasmus of Rotterdam. The guiding principles of that Neoplatonic network had been laid down by the collaboration of the great Byzantine Platonist Giorgio Cosimo de' Medici and Louis XI. The basic political program of this group, its global grand design, was to establish a worldwide system of humanist republics organized in the form of nation-states, as put forward in two of the faction's most basic programmatic documents, Platon's De Rebus Peloponnesi Oratio et the Second, and Machiavelli's The Prince. So, really quick pause. These are just two warring factions of the occult. One is save yourself through false light. The other was just dark subjugation and liberalism or whatever else. These are just two sides of the same coin. And remember, there are multiple competing factions between each other. The Freemasons, the Illuminati, the secret societies, all these people were kind of competing for a while. There are many threads, and of course Satan has to subjugate them. You know, in Jesus we have unity with one another because we're born again, and we're given the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit unites us with one another. There's unity, and we have something to pull us towards unity, to remember during times of conflict, disagreement, whatever else, that, hey, we're brothers and sisters. Well, think of that like from the opposite end of the spectrum with Satan. Satan has his reprobate, and they're all fighting against each other because they've been deceived and greedy and selfish for power. And he has to subjugate them. He has to subjugate them, and he's not doing it by love. He's doing it by deception. He's doing it by deception and power and seduction, and he has to subjugate all of these threads into one particular thread. So what you're witnessing as you look through history is all of these threads having to be subjugated, especially in the church age, because Satan has given his throne to a particular place. So there's conflict between these groups, but it doesn't mean that one group is better than the other. They're both occult and antichrist. Moving on. The first major project of the Society of Jesus after its founding was the massive republication and dissemination of Aristotle's works throughout Europe, in a period in which Aristotle had been thoroughly discredited and discarded despite the efforts of St. Thomas Aquinas 3 centuries earlier. The Society's second major project was the persecution and assassination of Giordano Bruno on charges of being a heresiarch, that is, the recognized leader of the international Neoplatonic humanist networks. The third major project of society, the launching of the Enlightenment, was a carbon copy of two historical precedents with which Jesuit insiders have always identified with great nostalgia. The Apollo cult's sophist movement in the Golden Age of Athens, launched as a counter-operation against the Ionian philosophical scientific movement, and the earlier so-called Akhenaton of Amenhotep II, Pharaoh, revolution in Egypt, which launched a fraudulent sun-worship monotheistic cult in order to smash the scientific technological revolution led by the priesthood of Amon. Nothing new under the sun, folks. These dialectics between these two warring sides of the occult have been going on for a long time, and they're going to be integrated. And this schizophrenic network is going to be integrated at the end of time so that Satan can receive worship. The second principal Jesuit technique, left-wing Jacobinism, was also developed as a carbon copy of earlier social control precedents, such as the Athenian democracy, which executed Socrates, and the Phrygian Orphic cults, which were deployed against the Ionian city-states. As the Marquis de Lafayette informed George Washington, the Jacobin movement of the French Revolution was the controlled creation of the Society of Jesus. In subsequent years, the Jesuit-controlled Jacobin networks in Europe were consolidated into international anarchist terrorist network under the Jesuit agent Mikhail Bakunin. In point of fact, Karl Marx was obligated to dissolve his first international specifically in order to prevent its capture from Bakunin's Jesuit terrorists. Marx, in a little-known internal document of the First International, last published in 1920 in Stuttgart under the title Karl Marx oder Bakunin, fully identified Bakunin as a Jesuit agent. The point to be made is that terrorism, anarchism, Jacobinism share with globalism and with the UN supranationalism the same central characteristic. They are the deadly enemies of the sovereignty of the nation-state, whether of republican or monarchist form. The same characteristic anti-authoritarian objection to the principle of the humanist nation-state permeates the spirit of Jesuit-engineered Enlightenment movement. Here lies the secret of Voltaire, the atheist Jesuit agent. Incidentally, the Society of Jesus is the only religious order which provides dispensations to those who its members want to change religious denomination, convert to non-Christian religions, or even become atheists on orders from the Society. Again, read The Art of War. It's all in there, man. It's all about the Jesuits. Teilhard de Chardin's Omega, the new Isocrates plan. Now, Teilhard de Chardin is one of the key figures in the development of modern New Age thoughts and ideas, and he influenced a lot of New Age thinkers and writers, so very important. Father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Jesuit, probably the most projected Jesuit intellectual of the current century after Karl Rahner, the friend of Avery Dulles, the Jesuit brother of the former CIA chief Alan Dulles, is more responsible than anyone else for a mass brainwashing form known as the Cult of the United Nations. Whenever, dear reader, you encounter some spaced-out, lovey-dovey, starstruck youngster who spouts out silliness about global consciousness, planetary citizenship, and other grandiose abstractions about the much-abused brotherhood of man, you can be sure that you are viewing the results of special form of brainwashing invented by the Jesuit father Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He, together with his close collaborator Julian Huxley, formed UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. He helped spawn a whole array of UN institutions such as the Food and Agricultural Organization, the brainwashing Tavistock-controlled World Health Organization, UNCTAD, and so on. Teilhard de Chardin himself was the personal protege of Princess Paula de Liège, wife of the Crown Prince of Belgium, Prince Albert. Today there exists an international Teilhard de Chardin Society whose chairman is Queen Elizabeth II of England, sharing honors with Queen Juliana of Holland. All peas in a pod. What is the objective of the globalist United Nations movement that Father Teilhard de Chardin launched and the Teilhard de Chardin Society today pursues? Believe it or not, the Teilhard de Chardin freaks call their objective the new international economic order. They maintain substantial ideological and programmatic control over the functions of such institutions as UNITAR, the Club of Rome, UNESCO, UNCTAD, and the World Council of Churches. Through those institutions, they exert a pernicious, subversive influence over the Third World government's policies, including governments of non-aligned nations. The type of new international economic order advocated by the combined forces of these institutions and by the local Jesuit priests and brothers deployed in Third World nations is based on zero-growth perspective. The developing nations are manipulated into a radical redispersionist political posture for the purpose of eventually creating a series of worldwide supernatural cartels under future United Nations jurisdiction. These are to regulate minutely the worldwide production and distribution of energy, copper, bauxite, iron ore, rare ores, coffee, sugar, and so forth, in precisely the way the IMF today regulates the last ounce of credit issued anywhere in the world. The purpose of moving control of all these economic resources out of the jurisdiction of sovereign nation states and under the faceless supranational authority of the international allied oligarchy is to establish a terminally stabilized zero-growth international society with Teilhard de Chardin, which he envisioned as his omega point, or to use his favorite term, great stability point. The European oligarchy's commitment to this omega point program clarifies certain important political events of recent years which otherwise would have remained inexplicable. Why was the power of the American state so systematically undermined from the assassination of President Kennedy to the Watergating of President Nixon to the election of President Carter? All of which, by the way, the Jesuits were involved in. And you can read about that too, like in Bill Hughes' The Secret Terrorists. For what particular interest did the United States government help to overthrow such obedient and servile allies as the Shah of Iran, Anastasio Somoza, Park Chung-hee of Korea? Why are various key agencies of the United States government pursuing such policies as deindustrialization and destruction of nuclear energy, apparently against the best perceived interests of the United States? Why has the National Security Advisor Brzezinski since 1977 been advocating a reduction of American world power in favor of a multipolar world in which our nation will presumably be obligated to share world responsibility with scores of such emerging powers such as China, Israel, and Brzezinski created the Khomeini Iran? Why is Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jesuit-trained Brzezinski from Jesuit McGill University, in virtually daily contact with the Pontifical Justia et Pax Commission in the Vatican, the chief Jesuit think tank in charge of revolutionary movements that Jesuits agents coordinate throughout Latin America? The answer to all these questions is that the present coalition of European and British oligarchs, which controls the pathetic Carter administration, is proceeding according to a plan, the Omega Point, which is conceptually a carbon copy of a plan carried out 23 centuries ago in Eastern Mediterranean, the Isocrates Plan. That was a scheme concocted by the cult of Apollo at Delphi, which united the leading oligarchs from Persia, Athens, Macedonia, and certain other areas in an effort to establish once and for all permanent political and social stability throughout the world. The devil's been at this New World Order thing since the very beginning, folks. He had it for a little while, then he was judged, the world was judged, and he's been trying ever since Babel, through, the ancient Egypt, through the Greeks, to the Romans. Nothing new under the sun. The Isocrates plan called for the use of Macedonian King Philip's armies with Persian aid to conquer all of Greece and the eastern Mediterranean coast down to the Sicilian gates, ensuring the final victory of oligarchist arms against the struggling Republican city-states. The domain east of the Sinope-Cilicia line would be readily pacified by Persian oligarchy allied to the Philip of Macedon. An era of permanent, eternal, great stability for the international oligarchy was thus envisaged. This is like 2,300 years ago with the Greeks and Persians. This plan, however, was disrupted by a series of military and political coups d'etats carried out by the Platonic Academy, which culminated with the civilizing triumph of Platonist Alexander the Great. Not coincidentally, Alexander's national security advisor, General Parmenion, was behaving then no differently than Zbigniew Brzezinski today. Alexander, however, gave his Brzezinski the boot. Do you see the intrigues throughout history where Satan is trying to get this new world order? God raises up another wicked person to judge basically this system, and then the judgment happens. Then the devil tries to pass the knowledge elsewhere, deceive people, create other movements, try again. Then God raises another power and so on. So it's just fascinating to see this throughout history. And you don't really get a sense of it unless you really go with a fine-tooth comb. And nothing new under the sun. Jesuit Jacobinism and the Third World Revolutionism. Contrary to popular myth, virtually all of the Third World radicalism emanates not from evil Moscow or intransigent Havana, but from the worldwide Jesuit organization. Except to the extent that gullible Moscow and gullible Havana fall for the Jesuit tricks in the way Moscow fell for the Philby Burgess McLean trick of Jesuit Maurice Oldfield. A case in point is Regis Debray, a Jesuit agent deployed into Cuba and Latin America, left by Jesuit operative François Mitterrand, the head of the French Socialist Party, which today maintains the continuity of the old anarcho-terrorist networks of Jesuit Bakunin. Leopold Senghor of Senegal, the inventor of the hideous term negritude, the inspirator of the Franz Fanon operation, a friend of Franz Joseph Strauss, according to his personal confession, was converted to Catholicism by none other than Pierre Teilhard de Chardin himself. Both Bani Sadr and Pol Pot, the Islamic revolutionary and the chief of the Khmer Rouge, respectively, were educated at Jesuit Jacques Soustel's École Pratique des Études Hautes at Sorbonne, which to this day remains under the joint control of the old Synarchist Crown of France and the Solvay Institute Louvain University, emanations of the Jesuit-controlled Belgian monarchy. The list could go on to include the happily aborted Michael Pablo, period of the Algerian Revolution, and an early attempt to launch Islamic fundamentalism years before the Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution. They've been practicing revolutions for a very long time, folks. That's why what's happening right now is nothing new. This is just the cream of the crop of all these revolutions, staged out through technology and social media and smoke and mirrors. A more elucidating point can be made about the case of Latin American movements, that continent being the universally acknowledged hotbed of Jesuit orders' liberation theology. Modern Jacobinism begins at the very top with the theology of Karl Rahner, who enforces the principle of cultural relativism in theology, asserting the necessity of theological respect for such cultural relative values as polygamy, homosexuality, ritual sacrifice, and provided they are accepted in one's traditional tribal value system. From there, the theological principle of cultural relativism is taken up by the grand theologian of liberation, Hans Kung, Tübingen University, and is promoted into the field of deployments of the Society of Jesus in the ghettos, the favelas, and the latifundios of Latin America. The technique is faithfully replicated by British intelligence in various distinct insurgency, counterinsurgency, and destabilization projects. The British, since at least 1688, have been crude vulgarizers of the Jesuit technique. This is the reason why the popular imagination in colonial or formerly colonial nations identifies the transparent and crude British with the principle of divide and rule, while the more sophisticated and elusive Jesuits are identified with the abstraction of hypocrisy. Before the 1964 General Congregation of the Jesuit Order elected Father Pedro Arrupe as the Father General, the overtly leftist projects of the Society were being run by the Society's front organization, the Maryknoll Fathers. After 1964, the Jesuits started openly espousing the leftist posture as well as their traditional rightist facade. Remember, just like with Hollywood, was originally Catholic. It was designed as a way to release Catholic propaganda into society. But then it went liberal, and now today you are seeing a switch back. Oh, we got to get those evil Jews and occult people, the Satanists, out of Hollywood. Well, wait a minute, everybody at the top is a Satanist. There's two sides, so people don't realize that. Their first large-scale operation was the Peruvian Revolution of 1968, which startled the world with the weirdest mutant of all the political animals up to that time, the notorious Peruvian way to socialism, supervised every step of the way by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. In Peru, the society had the advantage of maintaining undisputed monopoly over the education of the nation's entire ruling elite through the ultra-prestigious Pontificia Universidad Católica run by Felipe MacGregor's Society of Jesus. So at the top of the social pyramid, the civilian and the military elite was well profiled and tracked. At the bottom of the pyramid, the Jesuit organization under Pedro Carlos Pozo, S.J., was running mass organizations in the urban ghettos, the Círculos Católicos and the Fe Alegría movement. The Jesuits' sidekicks, the Maryknoll Fathers, were assigned to the agrarian reform operation. In September 1968, the Jesuits launched a new radical group with the acronym ONIS, headed by Padre Ricardo Antoncic, which issued a manifestation of radical demands. On October 3rd, 1968, General Velasco led a coup d'etat and formed a government which pronounced itself an adherent of Pedro Antonic's radical reform program. Thus, the Peruvian road to socialism was launched. In the new government, Padre Luna Victoria, S.J., ran the Office of Social Property. Padre Juan Wicht, S.J., now at Jesuit Boston College, ran the National Planning Institute and developed the first programs of population control and the new international economic order. Does that sound to you like the Reductions? Nothing different, just the scale has gotten bigger and is a little more complex, but it's the same thing. Padre Ricardo Morales, S.J., authored the educational reform law based on liberation theology. He ran a massive program reconditioning or conscientizing all of Peru's teachers by means of brainwashing techniques developed by Ivan Illich, the former Yugoslav Jesuit. Finally, Padre Morales startled the nation by issuing the new official textbook for public schools, featuring a prominent photograph of Fidel Castro's revolutionary Cuba with the caption, "Christianity and revolution go hand in hand." Padre Javier Girostiaga, Society of Jesus. The predominant technique for producing the brainwashed zombies that the society throws into activity to produce its Jacobin mobs, i.e. Antifa, is the technique perfected by one Padre Javier Girostiaga, S.J., the chief of the Society's Central American operations, and General Pedro Arrupe's fellow Basque. The technique, which Girostiaga imported from Venezuela to Panama in the early 1960s, is called Cursillos de Capacitación Social. It is described thusly by an eyewitness. Quote, "These social capacitation courses of Padre Girostiaga are intensive week-long brainwashing sessions. From the beginning, the subject is isolated from the world in a Jesuit retreat type of setting." It's funny because, just a quick pause, when I was at my Jesuit school, we had retreats every year, and they would get more and more like in-depth. I did go on one of them. But it reminds me that, like, well, gosh, maybe that was what their plan was, to basically indoctrinate you. There, the regime is strict, out of bed at the crack of dawn for calisthenics and paramilitary training. Spartan breakfast, and from there into classrooms for lectures on the evils of Marx, the need for agrarian reform, for workers' copartition, and so forth. A Spartan lunch follows, then house cleaning, then more paramilitary training. From there back to the classroom to study philosophy, mostly rhetoric and sophism and economics. A break for dinner, a rest period, and a social hour, singing and so forth, and then intensive prayers with emphasis on breaking down the subject's sense of identity. Following this, bed or guard duty. Then more of the same for 7 consecutive days. By the 6th night, during an intensely emotional rosary and Station of the Cross, most persons break down in tears and are ready to be saved and change their selfish ways to serve the people. The next day, the last, most people voluntarily make a commitment to join the Christian democracy, which by the merest of coincidences has several members of participating in the Cursillos, and whose program just happens to coincide with the church's as taught in the Cursillo. Oh yes, the key instructors are members of the Society of Jesus. Sounds like nothing new under the sun. The same way that they did with the Reductions is the same way they're continuing to doing in Latin America. Thus, the culling process begins for the newly brainwashed victim. From the Christian democratic way of serving the people, he moves gradually into more leftist revolutionary varieties, Maoist agrarian socialism, the Society's Chinese predilection, and onward to armed struggle. The great model of armed struggle is the guerrilla priest, Padre Camilo Torres, S.J., who was killed in the Colombian mountains serving the people in order to launch an even more notable career in the form of Camilo Torres armed struggle clubs all over Latin America and Italy, established by his surviving Jesuit brethren. There are today in Italy brainwashed members of the Killer Red Brigades and autonomisti, individuals who in the late 1960s were star-eyed members of the Movimiento Camilo Torres in the first soft phases of their Jesuit brainwashing. Now, as to the Venerable Padre Javier Garostiaga, who launched this form of brainwashing while in Panama. He was the director of the Society's affairs throughout Central America, and he now enjoys a very special position in the present government of Sandinista Nicaragua. He is currently the head of the economist section of the planning ministry. Economic section of the planning ministry. Garostiaga's operation in Nicaragua and Central America are supervised by only one other person, and that person is Father General Pedro Arrupe. Padre Garostiaga is notorious for having made notable attempts to imitate labor committees' language in his ministry's economic statements, a language which the Society of Jesus is very familiar from its encounters with labor committees' leaders in Peru and Colombia, where the labor committees succeed in totally wrecking the Jesuit social control projects. In the case of Peru, by forcing the society to drop its left facade. In Colombia, more happily, by taking over the programmatic orientation of its organized mass base in both peasant and trade union organizations. Padre Garostiaga, the man who formulated the language of his ministry's economic programs, is undoubtedly familiar with the Labor Committee's economic language, quote-unquote, from the Non-Aligned Nations Summit in Lima, Peru, the summit of the same international organization at Colombo, Sri Lanka, where Labor Committee's proposals were voted up in the form of debt moratorium resolutions, and in numerous other occasions in which the Labor Committees and the Society of Jesus crossed swords on certain early occasions. The adversaries not knowing each other by name, but only by programmatic and epistemological distinctions. But this is another story to be told in another time. Back to the Jesuit infiltration into the Nicaraguan government. There are a few other revolutionary Jesuits that have to be cleaned out. One such is the ubiquitous Padre Alvaro Arguello, the head of the Instituto de Investigación Histórica of the Universidad Centroamericana in Managua, who on good authority tells us was the ideological wise man of the Sandinista movement, who has significant impact on the present leadership's analysis and reflection capabilities. Sandinista, I think, was in Nicaragua. Padre Arguello's office at the Universidad Centroamericana is known to have functioned in the years before the Sandinista Revolution as the control and communication center of the Sandinista Front of National Liberation. Again, the universities are control centers. Today, Padre Arguello is Nicaragua's chief champion of the Christian Marxist dialogue, in charge of succoring gullible Cuban officials and others. In addition, the Nicaraguan government will become a much healthier proposition for the humanist movement when it rids itself of two other notorious Jesuit agents. One is Senior Ernesto Cardenal, the Minister of Culture, himself a religious man of Trappist background, but just the same as brother of a Jesuit, who describes himself as a follower of the Jesuit Arguello. Quote, "I am from the Christian Marxist layers of the Latin American Church." Cardenal, however, is more than a Christian Marxist. He is an Islamic fundamentalist who visited Iran last April to meet Ayatollah Khalkhali, the reputed chief sodomist of Tehran's central prison, and to proclaim to the world his praise of the Islamic Revolution. Finally, Nicaragua's foreign minister, Mr. Miguel de Ascolo, and Mary Noel Priest, who edited the hefty 5 million circulation Mary Noel magazine from Ossining, New York, until the eve of Anastasio Somoza's fall, and who only departed from New York's Kennedy International Airport to take up his revolutionary foreign minister's duties after he had one last farewell political session with Senator Ted Kennedy, then UN Ambassador Andy Young, and Young's aide, Brady Tyson, a man who, with more than a fair share in dirty tricks and attempted against the labor committees. Under the present circumstances, the Nicaragua government will prove to be of value to us of the humanist Neoplatonic movement if it succeeds in its efforts to frustrate the efforts of the Jesuit agents within it to steal the authoritative voice of a government in power for the purpose of giving credence to such Jesuit agents in official United Nations bodies as Irvin Leslow, the man at UNITAR from the Club of Rome, who is attempting to help the non-aligned movement redefine its concept of new international economic order in a way that would fulfill Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the Omega Point. Gosh, what a mouthful with all this stuff. And of course, this is just scratching the surface. Nothing new under the sun, folks. There's nothing new under the sun. From the Tower of Babel to the revolutions in Greece and Rome to the modern revolutions with the Jesuits in all these countries, Satan has continuously tried to get a new world order. Now, of course, again, there's many threads, and he has to subjugate all of them because this is the way that's going to go. The Pope is going to receive worship, and so everything has to go around that. So you're witnessing like a multi-headed hydra fighting against itself, and one head has to keep them all in line. Notice also how there are Jesuits placing both sides. This is another important thing. There's a lot of information I just read to you, but the point is to understand Jesuits are behind revolutions. They're heavily involved with communism. They're base of operations of these universities. They train other people. They influence other people. They start revolutions. They're very involved in all sides. They're also involved on both sides of the spectrum, left and right. Voltaire was an atheist, and there's a Jesuit dispensation to basically be whatever religion you want, meaning you could be a spy in whatever culture you want. That's why all these quotes on the Jesuits that I've read to you are true. And the Jesuit Oath is true, and all these things, the Secreto Monito is true. The Art of War is an accurate depiction of how the Jesuit order works, because whatever is necessary they will do. If I need to be an atheist, or I need to be a liberal, if I need to be, a Protestant, I will play my part. That's why this is Jesuit theater. Also, they have things like New Age Love and Light, with Teilhard de Chardin, Global Citizen, all this stuff that you see today, the Lucis Trust. All these people are peas in a pod. And of course, again, some of them may have conflicting views, and the perspective of those articles was from a long time ago. It's from 50 years ago, where the entire picture is not revealed yet. You see all these Jesuits starting communism and pushing the world towards the left. That was by design, because yes, America had to fall. It had to be depreciated. There had to be liberalization. And these things take a lot of time and generations, so that America could swing back to the right, reclaim its position as the world power, embrace nationalism, embrace religion, unite church and state, and then bring that to the rest of the world as the leader of the world. The same is with World War II. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is on Wikipedia. Bernhard Stumpf. Bernhard Stumpf was a Roman Catholic priest and journalist. He helped Adolf Hitler in writing the Mein Kampf. He was murdered in the Night of the Long Knives. So Bernhard Stumpf, who was a Jesuit, basically wrote the Mein Kampf for Hitler. Just like there's a lot of similarities between the Communist Manifesto and Rerum Novarum. This is Franz von Papen, and he was, one of these people in the Third Reich. But there's something here that the early life. Papen was born into a wealthy and noble Catholic family in Rural Westphalia, the third child of Frederick von Papen and his wife Anna Laura von Stephens. Was there something else that I highlighted? I feel like I highlighted something else here. Let's see. Yes, bringing Hitler to power. Here it is. On April 8th, Papen traveled to the Vatican to offer Reichskonkordat, Germans and their long words, man, that defined the German state's relationship to the Catholic Church. During his stay in Rome, Papen met the Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini and failed to persuade him to drop his support for the Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss. Papen was euphoric at the Reichskonkordat that he negotiated with Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli in Rome, believing that this was a diplomatic success that restored his status in Germany, guaranteed the rights of the German Catholics in the Third Reich, and required the disbandment of the Centre Party and the Bavarian People's Party, thereby achieving one of Papen's main political goals since 1932. So a very wealthy nobility Catholic was involved with the Catholic Church and negotiating all these things. The Catholic Church was very involved with the Third Reich, folks. Very much involved. Ideology of the SS. Let's see what the ideology of the SS is. The SS placed an intense emphasis in their indoctrination upon elitism and portrayed themselves as part of an elite order which explicitly modeled themselves on a historical version of religious orders, such as the Teutonic Knights or the Jesuits, whose dedication to a higher idea was admired in these otherwise anti-clerical circles. This is a quote by Himmler. Himmler says that he modeled his SS on the Jesuit order. So that should tell you everything. Here's another one, rat lines, World War II. There's so much of this stuff, but we're just kind of skimming. The rat lines were systems of escape routes for German Nazis and other fascists fleeing Europe from 1945 onwards in the aftermath of World War II. These escape routes mainly led toward havens in the Americas, particularly the Argentina, though also in Paraguay, Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay, Mexico, Latin America, so on and so forth. All of which were controlled by Jesuits, remember. There were two primary routes. The first went from Germany to Spain, then Argentina, then second Germany to Rome, then Genoa, then South America. The two routes developed independently but were eventually integrated. The route lines were supported by rogue elements of the Vatican, particularly an Austrian bishop and four Croatian clergy of the Catholic Church who sympathized with the Ustase. Starting in the 1947, U.S. intelligence utilized existing route lines to move certain Nazi strategists and scientists. Yeah, we'll get some too. You guys get some, we'll get some. We'll repopulate. Satan is not going to waste any of his efforts, folks. He's not going to waste any of his efforts. So why was the Catholic Church involved with hiding Nazis and bringing them to different places and everything else? Has the Catholic Church ever apologized for that? No, not at all. From the reductions in the 1600s to modern day, the Jesuits have been very active in Latin American countries. Communist regimes are Jesuit productions, and they play both sides. Do you see what you're supposed to see? These things are not things that just happen. Suddenly people decided to abolish religion and property and everything else. These things are fomented, and people are brainwashed, just like they're brainwashed by liberalism or everything else, or feminism. These things are movements designed to push society in a particular direction. And of course, we know from the Bible, thank God, that God has revealed to us the ultimate destination of history. This is Jesuits and Fidel Castro. This lady has a lot of videos, but she has some interesting things to say about Jesuits and Fidel Castro. Let's take a listen.
Fidel Castro is pure Iranian ancient bloodline, and he's directly descended from Pope Paul III. He's from the papal nobility family. He's from the Dukes of Castro. Alejandro Farnese, or Pope Paul III, worked for a Borgia, who was the Pope. When that Pope died, he made Alessandro Farnese a cardinal at 24, and then he made him Pope as his successor. I took photographs of paintings of Alessandro Farnese when he was young, and then when he was Pope, and then when he was a very old man as a Pope. And then I took paintings of his sons and their coats of arms. And then I found a painting of Fidel Castro in black, like a Spanish hat, and a black robe with just a tiny white collar peeking through. And I said, "What's this?" Well, it's his portrait, which will have his coat of arms added to it after he dies. Mm-hmm. And then that will be put in some palace in Italy. Almost all the Farneses have a middle name or first name of Alexander, Alejandro, or Alessandro. So Castro's name is Fidel Alejandro Castro. Fidel Castro.
And there you go. The more you learn, right? Remember the Jesuit general saying, "Oh, what makes you think we're not proud of Fidel?" So there's that. Nicaragua. Let's talk about the Catholic Church and Nicaragua. This is from JSTOR. The Catholic Church in the Nicaraguan Revolution, a Gramscian analysis. We'll just read a little bit here of the first preview page. Actually, yeah, we'll just read you can kind of see it. I'm not going to have my cursor on it so you can see it better. The Nicaraguan Revolution is unique because it was the first revolution in history which involved the active and continuing participation of large numbers of Christians as Christians. Remember Christian democracy? While both Catholics and Protestants played a significant role in the revolutionary process, particularly intriguing are the intricacies of the Catholic Church's participation both before and after the triumph of the Sandinistas in 1979. Though traditionally most of the institutional church had given its uncritical support to the country's dictatorial elites, in the mid-1960s, the sectors challenging the system of repressive rule began to grow. Through a complex process, by the time the Sandinistas marched victorious onto Managua in 19th July 1979, virtually the entire church, from laity to the archbishop, appeared briefly to be on their side. The development of this novel alliance and the manner in which it deteriorated throughout the 1980s has fascinated scholars. So let's see a little bit more about that. This is from Ortega and the Church, A Cautionary Tale. This is from Public Discourse, thepublicdiscourse.com. Cookie settings. Save and accept. Everything's disabled. Okay. the revolutionary priests bear more responsibility for the church's present hardship. They did not merely violate canon law, they did so for the sake of revolution. Now the church is suffering under a dictator that the revolution produced. This should serve as a cautionary tale to would-be revolutionaries for all political stripes. To make revolution is to set in motion unpredictable and destructive forces from which one may not escape. In August 2023, Daniel Ortega, president of Nicaragua and leader of the Sandinista party, expropriated the prestigious Jesuit-run Central American University. His government confiscated UCA's buildings and assets and evicted more than a dozen Jesuit priests living on campus. A week later, his government legally dissolved the Society of Jesus in Nicaragua and seized its finances and property, including hundreds of Fe y Alegría schools serving low-income families in rural areas. Now, before you quickly buy the Catholic narrative of, oh, we're being persecuted, look at these evil communist empires, remember who put them into power. This is not going to last. And very likely this is a ruse to make you basically froth at the mouth for religion. So remember that, because we looked at a very in-depth article from 50 years ago as to how these things actually were played out. These were the latest in a string of anti-Catholic actions taken by Ortega. Since 2022, his government has banned public Catholic gatherings, including the Easter procession, in most municipalities. It is surveilling masses. It has expelled several Catholic missions and charities from the country and shut down or confiscated over 24 Catholic colleges. It has imprisoned and exiled a dozen Catholic priests. It recently sentenced the Bishop of Metagalpa, Rolando Alvarez, the Nicaraguan church's leading government critic, to 26 years in prison. A lot can change in 2 generations. In the 1970s and 1980s, liberationist Catholics played a critical role in Sandinista revolution. Many left-wing priests and Catholic activist networks participated in the multi-year insurrection that toppled dictator Anastasio Somoza. 4 revolutionary priests served as ministers in Ortega's first Sandinista government in 1979-1990. So the question is, if the snake controlled the government, you really think the snake's going to lose control? What's really going on here? Ortega's evolution from revolutionary in the 1970s to dictator in the 2010s and 2020s is not especially surprising. As Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way argue in their 2022 book, Revolution and Dictatorship, successful revolutions, i.e. France in 1789, Russia in 1917, China in 1949, and Cuba in 1959, Nicaragua and Iran in 1979, tend to give rise to repressive, often totalitarian dictatorships. And if you look at each one of these single revolutions, you find a Jesuit. Revolutionary regimes notoriously eat their own, narrowing and turning against individuals and groups that initially support them. Nicaragua is no exception. In the 1970s and 80s, Ortega depended on the support of Catholics. Now he's targeting them, including former allies. Nicaragua's revolutionary Catholics bear some responsibility for this turn of events. By participating in the Sandinista revolution that brought Ortega to power, they unwittingly helped to sow the seeds of the Nicaraguan church's present crisis. Now, really quick pause. I want to, we have a little more to read on this, but I want to interject here with something very important. If you espouse a synergistic view of salvation and a synergistic view of reality, you are very likely to get manipulated by these types of things. The way this is being presented to you is obviously more whitewashed than the previous articles that I read to you. You understand? The previous articles were very in-depth and pointing to the snake. They had their own issues too, but nevertheless, for the most part, they were pointing out the truth. This article is documenting some of those things, but it's like, oh, some liberal priests. Oh, no. The Jesuit order, which is a military sovereign state, was involved with these revolutions. So it doesn't really tell you that. And the way this presents it to you is, well, this kind of happened, and then people freely chose to do this, and then that kind of happened, and people freely chose to do that, and then this is just now out of control, and we need to learn from it. This is a synergistic point of view, because probably the person who wrote this is a Catholic. The right point of view is that God is sovereign over all things, that everything happens by God's design, and of course God has given us a very detailed view of the end of history. What that means is the end. Like it says in Isaiah 46, I declare the end from the beginning. The end has been predetermined. That means all actions are being actuated and linked to that particular end. Now, we don't have every single thing that's going to happen, but we are given very important time markers and prophetic markers to watch so that we understand the trajectory of history, which has been predetermined. If the Bible tells you that the devil gave his power and throne to the papal institution, if you see that the Jesuits are created in history and they're basically using all the power they have all of the wealth they have to bring about this outcome, then you know that there's no such thing as things that just happen, especially since we are after the mortal wound. And what happens after the mortal wound is that the beast is resurrected and comes to power and is marveled at. So we are at the final leg of history, folks. Thank God it's not going to be that much longer, but it's the final leg of history. Meaning the things that happen, given the fact that Satan is ruling the earth through the Catholic Church, are not things that just kind of happen and they got out of control and now we don't know what to do. These things are choreographed. Just like Ortega now persecuting, quote unquote. Of course, some of these people are real Catholics who I feel very sorry for. But he's on orders to do that. He's on orders to do that so that there is a justification to bring back religion. And of course, that's exactly what's going to happen. So don't be fooled. You saw that painting of, what's his name? The guy, what's his name? Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, he's painting with a nice little priestly outfit and a little white collar. What does that tell you? It tells you that he's a Jesuit deep down inside. Remember, you could be an atheist, you could be a Protestant, you could be a liberal, you could be a conservative. Whatever you need to be, you fit in. If you need to be an atheistic revolutionary, then go ahead, be an atheistic revolutionary. Synagogue of Satan. Saying one thing, but doing another. Duplicitous life. A duplicitous way of being. This is exactly what we're dealing with. So my point is, as I'm reading to you this, do not get swayed by the idea that, well, this just kind of happened. No, this was choreographed. And the question in our minds should be, why is the Catholic Church so involved with all of these intrigues? Moving on. 1979, Ortega and the church were engaged in a common struggle against the corrupt, violent dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza. Social opposition to Somoza took off in the aftermath of 1972 Managua earthquake, which killed thousands, left hundreds of thousands homeless, and destroyed 80% of Managua's commercial property. To the outrage of the public, Somoza used much of the international relief aid to enrich himself and his cronies. By 1974, he personally owned roughly a quarter of the Nicaraguan economy. Well, that's not going to do for the snake, because the snake needs to subsume all authority. So now we need to find a way to get you out of here, Somoza. Somoza became deeply unpopular and revolution was in the air. The recent Cuban Revolution had inspired a generation of Latin American college students, including the leadership of the left-wing guerrilla organization, the Sandinista National Liberation Front. In 1974, the FSLN resurfaced and began an insurrection against the Somoza regime. Ex-political prisoner Daniel Ortega was one of its main leaders. Around this time, liberation theology, a fusion of Christianity and Marxism, caught fire amongst progressives Latin American Catholics. Many Catholic university students in Nicaragua, including UCA, sympathized with Sandinista and actively collaborated with them. So did a number of influential priests, which they don't dare to tell you that these were all Jesuit people, Jesuit trained. But the vast majority of the clergy and laity, including the church's most well-known and influential prelates, did not support the revolutionaries at this time. Although they broke with Somoza in the mid-1970s because of his corruption and ineptitude, they rejected armed struggle and advocated a peaceful transition into democracy. Only in 1979, after Somoza refused to submit to a negotiated transfer of power and resorted to an extreme repression, did the Catholic establishment come to regard the insurrection as a tragic necessity. Remarkably, the insurrection succeeded. In 1979, after insurgent forces encircled Managua, Somoza resigned and fled the country. Father Miguel Obando y Bravo, the Archbishop of Managua and Nicaragua's most popular figure, said a mass celebrating Somoza's fall and commemorating the dead. This is just one occult group taking over another evil group. Satan's like, look, you got to get out of here, Somoza. Yeah, you're evil and you're deceived, but the new thing is this Catholic thing, so we're going to topple your government now. One evil versus another. The Sandinistas emerged as Nicaragua's dominant political force, and liberationist priests occupied major roles in the new Sandinista regime. Father Fernando Cardenal, who was a Jesuit, oversaw a national literacy campaign in 1980 and later assumed the role of education minister from 1984 to 1990. 3 other priests served in the cabinet positions. Father Miguel de Escoto as foreign minister, Father Ernesto Cardenal as minister of culture, and Father Edgar Perales as minister of social welfare, and permanent UN representative in 1982 to 1986. In addition, Envio, a Jesuit magazine founded in UCA in 1981, provided sympathetic coverage to the Sandinistas and Ortegas throughout the 1980s. Why has nobody ever questioned this? People think the Jews are the ones who are communists, but it's not true. But the church as a whole kept a critical distance from the government and, after a short period, turned against the Ortega and Sandinistas. Archbishop Obando y Bravo and fellow prelates raised early concerns about the spread of godless communism. They castigated, no, we want godful communism. Do you get it? We don't want godless communism. We want godful or godly communism. They castigated leftist demonstrators who disrupted a mass celebrated by Pope John Paul II during his 1983 visit to Nicaragua. They condemned the Sandinistas' legalization of abortion and promotion of contraception. They argued against liberation theology and banned the liberationist Nicaraguan peasant mass. They rebuked the revolutionary priests in the cabinet for violating Catholic canon law. In 1985, Obando y Bravo toured the country and forcefully criticized the Sandinistas in well-attended public addresses. Pope John Paul II supported the Nicaraguan bishops. In his 1983 visit, he scolded Father Ernesto Cardenal on the tarmac of the Managua airport and told him he must resign from his cabinet position. After Cardinal and the other revolutionary priests refused, the Pope laicized Perales on Perales' request and suspended the priesthoods of the other three. He also pressured the Jesuits to expel Father Fernando Cardinal. In 1985, he made Archbishop Obando y Bravo a cardinal. Responding to the suspension, Fernando Cardinal wrote in a 1984 open letter that he could not, quote, conceive of a God that would ask him to abandon his commitment to the people. It was possible, he opined, to be faithful to the church and also to devote himself to the service of the poor in Nicaragua from within the Sandinista revolution. Now, saying one thing, doing another, just like the Templar orders, just like the reductions. It's always putting the poor and the children and the weak in front as a front to do your dirty deeds. Notably, the Nicaraguan church establishment did not condemn the Contras. Shortly after the Sandinistas took power, a broad anti-Sandinista counterinsurgency developed, the Contras, with financial and military assistance from the United States, which, by the way, was what? Ruled by the Jesuits at that point in time. You will learn that because we have to go back in time again and see how the Jesuits were taking over the United States. By that point in time, the Jesuits were controlling the United States through the Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, Knights of Malta, all these various intrigues. So the United States was the sword of the papacy by that point in time. So keep that in mind. The insurgents included ex-members of the Somoza regime, disillusioned ex-revolutionaries and anti-Sandinistas who had not directly participated in the revolutionary conflict. Obando y Bravo admitted a certain sympathy for them, and the Bishop of Huicalpa, Pablo Vega, affirmed the right to insurrection. As the Contras War escalated, the Sandinistas clamped down on civil liberties, including those of the church. State-run media attacked opposition priests and bishops. The government expelled 10 foreign priests. Bishop Vega visited Washington, D.C. in 1986 to defend the Contras, after which the Sandinistas sent him into exile. The Sandinistas also exiled Father Bismarck Caballo, director of Radio Católica and influential government critic. Catholic leaders, including Archbishop Obando y Bravo, condemned these actions. In the 1990 presidential election, Ortega suffered a surprise defeat in part due to opposition from the church. Prelates and priests quietly supported opposition candidate Violeta Chamorro, and Obando y Bravo endorsed her in his Sunday sermons. Many Catholic grassroots groups participated in the Chamorro's campaign. Ortega lost two subsequent re-election bids in 1996 and 2001. Before the 1996 election, Obando y Bravo urged Nicaraguans not to vote for Ortega, and the Sandinistas retaliated by publicly attacking the church. Just like how, by the way, recent European elections, how all the bishops were telling people to vote in a certain way, and how the church, quote unquote, the church leaders, which are all Jesuit infiltrators of the United States, all these evangelicals, you got to vote or else you're part of the deep state. Do you notice a trend here? You have to remember, again, just a quick pause, but you have to remember that Satan's empire works by force and coercion and deception and temptation and desires and fear. It's not by love. Satan is not capable of love. So he has to constantly, every deception that he starts, to rein it in, he has to constantly cause more conflict and violence and subjugation and deception. And he's constantly having to thread these threads together through deception. Whereas God does it the other way around. God is love. God threads people with love and brings them together with fellowship and union and compassion and so on. So it's completely opposite of the way God does things, the way Satan does. But if you understand that, you understand why there's so many of these heads fighting with each other, constantly trying to rein each other in. And of course, you know what the ultimate head is. It's the papacy. And that needs to centralize everything around there. So, where were we at? Well, following his 2001 loss, Ortega sought to make amends with the church. He apologized for past hostilities and promised if he was elected in 2006 to pass an unconditional abortion ban. He also agreed to marry his partner, Rosario Murillo, in a Catholic ceremony. A deal was struck, and as a gesture of reconciliation, Archbishop Obando y Bravo said a mass on the 25th anniversary of Sandinista Revolution and officiated the Ortega-Murillo marriage in 2005. Ortega's gambit paid off. In 2006, he improbably returned to power, riding a wave of left-wing presidential victories across Latin America. He has not left the presidency since. Today, Nicaragua is one of the only 3 dictatorships in Latin America. Each year, Freedom House gives every country in the world a political freedom score between 0, completely unfree, and 100, completely free, which even that's subjective, but either way. This year, the 20 countries of Latin America received an average score of 64 and a median score of 69. Only 3 countries scored below 48. Cuba at 12, Venezuela at 15, and Nicaragua at 19. Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are stark authoritarian outliers in the region, and they were all started by Jesuit operatives, and people that are in the club. Ortega's regime has come to resemble Somoza's in many ways, nepotistic, corrupt, and repressive. His wife holds the vice presidency, and Ortega loyalists dominate all branches of government. A stacked Supreme Court manipulated the Nicaraguan Constitution in 2011 and 2014 to allow Ortega indefinite re-election. In the lead-up to the 2016 election, it barred several opposition candidates from running against Ortega. Since 2014, Ortega has faced a series of mass protests that peaked in intensity in 2018. In response, the Ortega government descended into full-fledged authoritarianism, killing hundreds of protesters and imprisoning over 1,000. Don't worry, it's coming down pretty soon. They have to bow their knee back to their masters. The UCA was but again, my particular feeling is these things are by Jesuit orders to create the dialectic that needs to bring religion back to this country. The UCA, and as a result, religion back to other countries in Latin America. The UCA was a major hub for the protests, and Rector Father Jose Iliaquez opened the campus as a safe haven for imperiled demonstrators. In response, the Ortega government denied Iliaquez re-entry to Nicaragua after he took a trip abroad. Later, the government cut off the UCA's public funds. Ortega has clamped down on all forms of opposition since 2018. His government has arrested dozens of opposition politicians, permanently banning lead presidential rivals from contesting or holding office, and shut down opposition media outlets and scores of universities and civil societies organizations. Roughly 200,000 Nicaraguans have sought refuge in neighboring Costa Rica. A significant personal and institutional risk. At significant risk, church leaders such as Bishop Rolando Alvarez have publicly condemned Ortega's repression. Ortega now treats the church as an enemy, and the 56-year-old Alvarez is in prison, serving a 26-year sentence. Today, Nicaraguan Catholics are more united against Ortega than they were in the 1980s. That is the point. Almost all of the Ortega's erstwhile Catholic allies have deserted him. Fernando and Ernesto Cardenal resigned from the FSLN in the 1990s and remained critics of the Ortega government until their deaths in 2016 and 2020, respectively. Pro-government protesters disrupted Ernesto Cardenal's 2020 funeral, shouting "Traitor" and "Long live Daniel." Edgar Porrales became a prominent critic of Ortega too. In 2021, state authorities arrested him and sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Later, they moved him into house arrest. In some ways, the Nicaraguan church is more vulnerable now than it was in the 1980s. The 1980s, Ortega faced intense international scrutiny, especially from the U.S. The Reagan administration used Ortega's repression of civil society to justify aid to the Contras, giving Ortega's an incentive to exercise restraint. Today, the cost of persecuting the opposition is lower from Ortega's perspective. In addition, Catholicism is in decline in Nicaragua. When the Sandinistas took power in 1979, evangelical Christians were 5% of the population. Now they are 30 to 40%. Today, roughly as many Protestants as Catholics regularly attend church in Nicaragua. Ortega does not need Catholic support as much as he used to, and he knows it. Since taking office in 2007, he has offered subsidies and tax breaks to scores of evangelical churches. Recently, he has allowed politically compliant evangelicals to assemble in public while denying Catholics that right. You think that this isn't by design? Ortega's son and potential heir, Laureano Ortega Murillo, has made high-profile public appearances at evangelical services and celebrations alongside Managua's pro-Ortega mayor. Nicaragua's medium-term political future is highly uncertain. No, it's very certain. Nicaragua will bow to the beast just like the rest of the world will. This is all dialectic. But again, if you're a synergist and you don't have the lens of prophecy and history leading up to this point, as we've belabored to do in this presentation, then, it's uncertain. What's going to happen? We know what's going to happen, folks. they're going to bow to the beast. And this is just a dialectic to justify an influx of religious nationalism. Ortega is 77 years old and his regime is personalistic, which increases the risk of a succession crisis. Yeah, he's on his way out. It's all perfectly timed. On the other hand, he has hobbled the domestic opposition. He is not facing much regional or international pressure to liberalize. And he has important regional and international allies like Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, and increasingly China. How long his regime will stay in power is anybody's guess. My guess is a couple years. At 1996 Mass in Managua's cathedral, before a congregation of thousands, Archbishop Obando y Bravo told a parable about a viper. In it, 2 men are walking down the road when they see a viper dying of cold. One of the men takes the snake into his arms and warms it, revives the snake, and immediately bites and kills him. Does this sound like somebody else who told you a parable of the snake? Many interpreted the parable as a veiled message not to vote for Ortega in 1996. Ironically, Obando y Bravo ignored his own advice a decade later by helping to revive Ortega's political power, and Ortega ultimately turned on the Catholic Church. But the revolutionary priests bear more responsibility for the Church's present hardship. They did not merely violate canon law, they did so for the sake of revolution. We read this part in the beginning. So, my goodness, conclusion with this one. Well, why the million-dollar question you should ask yourself with all of this, between the articles that we looked at with Fidel Castro, with Nicaragua, with the Jesuits in all these countries, with all the ones that we just read up to now. Why is the Catholic Church so entrenched in politics and intrigues? Why? Why are these priests double agents, secret society members? Why are they doing all these revolutions? Why are they fomenting these things? What's going on here? Catholic apologists will point to these types of conflicts that are quote-unquote against the church, and the church is being persecuted, and say, look, people hate Catholics all around the world, and the church, the bride of Christ, is just being attacked. It's nonsense, folks. If you understand that the same hand, when I use that picture of the two hands playing chess, the meme of the two hands playing chess, and there's like this dark evil hand with claws, and then there's like this light manicured hand, and the point is you look at that and say, oh, that's Jesus versus the devil, and that's the way it's supposed to go, right? No, that's the point. Under the chess table is the devil playing himself with two hands. He's got a really ugly looking hand and a beautiful hand to come and save you from the ugly hand. Do you get it? So this is the point. People are stuck with their perspective. They're stuck on the chessboard. If you're a synergist, you are immediately sucked into the chessboard. Do you get it? If I'm on the chessboard, I'm looking around, it seems like, well, there's a big hand there, moving the pieces, and maybe you don't even see the hands. Maybe you just see the pieces moving. And to you, it seems like, oh, it's uncertain, future, there's things going on, left and right, dark and light, blue and red. But if you zoom out a sec and you take your perspective outward, you see the devil under the table and he's grinning and he's playing himself. You're like, oh, now I get it. So perspective is everything, folks. And the only way to get perspective is to know your history. And that's exactly why I've belabored to give you so much of it in this presentation. Exhaustive history, so that you understand and you can see and not be sucked into the chessboard. These are artificially created conflicts. Of course, they're real, and real people are getting put in prison. Real people are getting killed, and it's really sad. But the people who are orchestrating these things are artificially creating them to justify the next thing, which is ultimately a desire for papal supremacy, a desire for religion and nationalism connected to the Pope, just as it was in the Holy Roman Empire. Dark to light. Remember, all these are made by Jesuits and Jesuit infiltrators, Jesuit spies, Jesuit agents, and so on. Now, let's look at China, which of course is very significant. This is an article from darknessisfalling.com, and it says, the Jesuits planned the Great Chinese Genocide. China today is controlled by Rome through her communist regime. Dear reader, you're probably reading this because of curiosity about the titles. You're probably having difficulty connecting Mao Zedong, Yale University, Skull and Bones, and the Jesuits. You might not even know anything about these entities. That's okay, most people don't. Why is that? Well, it's because textbooks' mainstream history has been sanitized, and the pertinent facts have been removed by the writers, some of whom know the truth and can't or won't disclose it, and others who refuse to believe the facts. You see, history and science are controlled by the Jesuit mainstream media, which they own through proxy or front companies. This is a documented fact and must be accepted in order to proceed with this article. Failure to do this is a waste of your time. I haven't spent countless hours investigating this just to write fiction or play some kind of joke on readers. This is my small way of warning people that what they have been told by the authorities or experts is mostly trash. Okay, let's put face to the evil that I'm talking about. Below are the 4 Jesuit superior generals who planned and oversaw Mao's bloody communist reign of terror in China through the OSS, CIA, and Skull and Bones Society. Over 56 years from 1920 until his death in 1976. These 4 men alone are responsible for planning much of the war and bloodshed of the 20th century. And of course, these 4 men are the various superior generals of the Society of Jesus. Look, there's 4 of them. There you go, nice little sign. Pedro Rupa is flashing. Why is Mao Zedong important? In simple terms, this man was selected, trained, and used by the Jesuits through their Skull and Bones and OSS, precursor to the CIA, agents to exterminate, eradicate the whole strata of Chinese society, including culture, religion, and in particular Protestant Christians. In order to control the world, it was first necessary to totally subdue the most populous country in the world and transform it into a future sword to be used against the United States. Using Mao as a sword, the Jesuits destroyed all resistance of the people through a strategy of constant agitation from a 2-party conflict. Civil war and then intra-party conflict between the different factions of the Communist Party, grinding down the resolve of a nation of 56 groups of people, then numbering some 700 million people and now numbering some 1.3 billion. Through long decades of suffering and deprivation, the Chinese people would come to long for peace and safety and capitulate to Mao's tyranny in order to obtain them. What we are told about Mao is a mishmash of fact and fiction. In fact, one has to really dig to find the truth about who he was and how and why he was able to do the things he did. Most books written about Mao were orchestrated by the Jesuits, using their bought journalists who presented a favorable picture to the West of this depraved and corrupt man. There are enough facts available outside of the mainstream sources now to get a fairly clear picture of what happened. I have attempted to summarize the salient facts here along with URLs so you, the reader, can get the truth without reading volumes. Mao is the greatest killer in the world history. No other Luciferian tyrant comes anywhere close to him. Estimates based on population loss put the figure between 70 and 80 million people murdered. By comparison, he makes Genghis Khan look like a schoolboy. Mao had written in the early 1920s that China must be destroyed and then reformed. His cold-blooded dedication to the systematic destruction of old China and his unwavering loyalty to his Jesuit masters is unparalleled. With Joseph Jugosvili Stalin of Russia, another savage Jesuit-controlled Luciferian puppet and mass murderer, coming in second place at 40 to 50 million victims. So crazy. Mao Zedong's purge of the Chinese people killed off all the educated and wealthy families whose fortunes were confiscated and were deemed as opposition to the Jesuits and their aim of putting into place a servile communist regime totally under the dictate of the Roman Catholic Church. Through wholesale slaughter, torture, deprivation, and terror, Mao reduced the Chinese people to abject poverty and slavery. All fascist dictators do this, ensuring compliance and complicity of the people through fear, pain, suffering, and death. The new China, funded secretly by the Jesuit-controlled Roman Catholic Knights of Malta, bankers through the USA Wall Street, has risen on a massive grave of the victims to dominate world commerce and trade just as the Jesuits intended. China is being used as a sword to influence world events. Just as the Jesuits did with Russia, with their Vatican banker-funded 1917 Bolshevist revolution onward, so the Jesuits have done in China. Dear reader, their strategy is always the same. First, they foment a bloody revolution to clear away the old order and any opposition. Then they institute an autocratic regime they control. Now, really quick pause. Does that sound like something that's happening today? The new world order is being done away with, and the light is coming. The golden age is coming. We're going to do away with all these people, and we're going to put our own order in. Secretly, advanced technologies, weapons, and finance were funneled into China from the USA and Russia in return for obedience in cooperating with the Jesuits' long-term plan for New World Order, which is a world government. There is a powerful demonic mix of high finance, political, and spiritual power and Luciferian sorcery driving the Jesuits' wicked 500-year-old plan. Mao's early history. Mao Zedong was born in December 1893, in Shaoshan Village, Hunan Province in China. His father, Mao Yichang, was formerly impoverished peasant who had become one of the wealthiest farmers in Shaoshan. Mao described his father as a stern disciplinarian who would beat him and his 3 siblings, the boys Zem, Min, and Zetan, as well as an adopted girl, Zhejian. What Mao doesn't say is he was rebellious and lazy and refused to work and help his family so frequently he fought with his father, and this This formed his ungrateful, spoiled, and eventually diabolical, vengeful persona. He loved his mother, who never disciplined him, but hated his father, who tried to guide his future. He even walked away from an arranged marriage at 14 and claimed never to have consummated the marriage. This wife died within a year, but we aren't told the cause. Mao became a Buddhist like his mother Wen Kuimei, but abandoned his faith in his mid-teenage years. Here we see an attempt at religion, but the quick abandonment of the spiritual quest at an early age for the pursuit of material pleasures. In 1901, at age 8, Mao was sent to Shaoshan Primary School. Mao read voraciously and developed a political consciousness from Zheng Guaning's book, which lamented the deterioration of Chinese power and argued for the adoption of representative democracy. In 1909, at age 16, Mao moved to a higher primary school in nearby Dongshan, where he was bullied for his peasant background. Here is further mistreatment suffered and deeper bitterness and hate accumulating. In 1911, Mao began middle school in Changsha Yali School. This is where Mao meets his Yale in China Skull and Bones teachers from USA, who arrived to start the school in 1903 or 1904. There isn't 100% conclusive proof, but little doubt in my mind based on all the written accounts surrounding Mao's early life, that the Jesuits organized the Yale in China mission as they had founded and controlled Skull and Bones, as well as all other secret societies worldwide, well before that date in history. Maybe as early as 1814, when the Jesuits reemerged and were reinstated by the Pope. Mao was a disturbed young man, a completely controllable, blackmailable puppet for the purposes of the Jesuit controllers. The 1903 Treaty of Shanghai between the Qing dynasty and Japan opened the city to foreign trade. Consequently, factories, churches, and schools were built. A college was started by Yale University bachelors, which later became a medical center named Shangya and a secondary school named Yali School. In 1904, Changsha was open to foreign trade, and large numbers of Europeans and Americans settled there. Changsha was the site of Mao Zedong's conversion to communism. Question: who recruited and groomed Mao, a middle school-aged boy, for his future role as a revolutionary dictator? It's obvious his teachers did. All secret society foment and promote communistic revolutions to further societal destabilization, the destruction of independent nationalist sovereign governments, human freedoms, and the implementation of a fascist New World Order communist government under the power of Rome. This is the sole mission of the Jesuits and has not changed for 500 years. In achieving this, the Jesuits make the Pope an absolute world dictator. Yali School, Yale in China, founding years. Brownell Gage, Warren Seabury, Lawrence Thurston, and Arthur Williams, all graduates of Yale College in the 1890s, founded Yale in China and brought the mission to Changsha between 1901 and 1905. In 1906, the mission's preparatory school, or the Yali School, began operations. Revolutionary sentiment was strong in the city of Changsha. The question again is, who was behind the scenes fomenting this idea of revolution in Changsha? The Jesuits had already been working in China recruiting young Chinese into the order from their schools dotted all over China for more than 200 years. True. There was already 200 schools by 1687, so how many were there by 1911? Note, revolution is a Jesuit invention to destroy peace, order, civility, and social progress. There is nothing good about revolution. The result is always anarchy, betrayal, and death. The mind boggles at how many millions of young Chinese students were willing and ready to blindly join a revolutionary cause and sacrifice themselves for no reason other than change based on a whimsical utopian idea, fed to them by foreign Jesuit teachers who betrayed their trust. Mao led millions of them to the slaughterhouse, Judas Iscariot that he was. All tyrants betray and slaughter their own people without compassion or remorse. They always say it's for the greater good, lying, murdering psychopaths, which, by the way, comes back to this idea that, well, it's the Jews. No, it's not. No, it's not. Just because people like Stalin were Jews or Trotsky or whatever else doesn't mean that you lump them in with all the Jewish people. They could care less about anybody else other than themselves. So you have to remember that. The Jesuits always created two opposing sides, which they support, but inevitably one is betrayed, so the preferred side achieves a maximum kill rate in exterminating people groups viewed as obstacles to their plans. In particular, Protestant Christians of any kind and non-cooperative liberal Catholics. Yeah, that's why JFK was assassinated, by the way, because he was a liberal Catholic. The Republicans' figurehead, nationalist opposition, was Sun Yat-sen, an American-educated Christian who led the Tongmengyu Society. Supporting the revolution, Mao joined the rebel army as a private soldier, but was not involved in fighting. With the Xinhai Revolution over, Mao resigned from the army in 1912 after 6 months as a soldier. Over the next few years, Mao Zedong enrolled and dropped out of a police academy, a soap production school, a law school, an economic school, and the government-run Changsha Middle School. This record of dropouts is a clear sign of deficiency in character. He was unable to apply himself in anything because he felt superior to all these pursuits. Studying independently, he spent much time in Changsha Library, reading core works of classical liberalism such as Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, as well as the Western scientists and philosophers such as Darwin, Mill, Rousseau, and Spencer. Viewing himself as an intellectual, years later he admitted that at this time he thought himself better than working people. Mao was a hypocrite, an elitist, who then becomes a leader of a common cause, the struggle of the common man for an egalitarian society. What irony! He was inspired by Friedrich Paulsen, whose liberal emphasis on individualism led Mao to believe that strong individuals were not bound by moral codes, but should strive for the greater good. And the end justifies the means, the conclusion of consequentialism. The end justifies the means is a core Jesuit maxim, so right there is Mao's quotation that we have to the evidence of the Jesuit mind. Remember, the common good is a Jesuit term. Now, I want to offer a caveat with this, though, because this is important in terms of the Bible. The Bible describes to you a plan by a sovereign being who is omniscient, omnipotent, he's perfect, he can't make any mistakes, and he declares the end from the beginning. And the end is God's glory. God's glory. God is infinitely glorious. The highest possible experience you could ever have is being in God's presence. God is infinitely glorious. The glory of God has infinite value. Therefore, all things are in alignment with the glory of God. They will be for the glory of God, both evil and good. God works all things for the good, and he will be glorified. So, from that perspective, the end does justify the means, because there are many people who stumble over the problem of evil in the world and a sovereign God. That's why they compromise and say, well, evil just happens because, people are evil. Yes, people are wicked and we're corrupt and we have flesh and we live in a fallen world. But from a perspective of a sovereign God, God has predetermined all evil to reveal his glory. The cross in Acts 4 is the most evil thing that's ever happened. The innocent, beautiful, infinitely valuable creator in human form to be brutally tortured to death like a criminal. That is the most evil thing possible. And yet, it tells you in Acts 4 that it was predestined. It was predestined. It was predestined for the greatest possible glory, to redeem God's name as a judge, to show you that he's completely serious about sin without making you pay for it, and to provide a way to give his spirit freely so that we could worship him forever and be in that maximum experience, which is his presence on earth. That is a maximal good. Therefore, God confounds your understanding of what is good or evil in the sense of it's not up to you to judge God's methods. We know what is good based on the moral code and based on what God has revealed. But at the same time, we also can't judge what is truly good or evil because you don't know how God is going to use something. God is promising to you that he uses all things for the good. So that is the anchor to anchor all things. And of course, the greatest good is God's glory. So from that perspective, all things are justified because God is perfect. He has made the decisions beforehand. He is wrapping and anchoring everything into himself and his glory, and his glory will be revealed. Evil will reveal God's justice, and it will also reveal God's mercy by providing to his elect. All the suffering that we go through reveals God's provision, and that he's our comforter, that he's our savior, and so on. So there are many purposes to evil, to pain, to suffering in this side of eternity that all serve the glory of God. If you do not have a sovereign view of God, you will really stumble over that. And a lot of people do. And they say, well, how could God do this? Or how could God do that? Well, the ends justify the means. Because first off, the end is infinitely valuable. And the one who is implementing those ends is perfect. He can't make mistakes. So the ends do justify the means. So let's not give the devil too much credit here. Now, with that in mind, with that biblical foundation in mind, when we come to this sentence that I just read to you, that it's a core Jesuit maxim, the ends justify the means. Well, yeah, the Jesuits and the devil and the satanic power of the world wants to be God, right? So therefore, they're going to create their own dialectics, their own dark to light, their own justification of their means, and their own version of what is good. That is Antichrist. That is evil. Because the means that they're implementing is completely against God. It's rebellious. it's death. So yes, that is evil. In that sense, from that perspective, again, who are you obeying? Who is the source of the action? If it's God, yes, the ends justify the means. Absolutely. God is perfect. He has predetermined all things perfectly and in perfect timing, and will reveal his glory through each and everything that he's predetermined. It's not up to us to justify, to say, well, that's not justified, God. How can you possibly say that? Now, when you are dealing with a human authority, absolutely, it's Antichrist. So, just an important distinction. Moving on. Befriending Mao, Professor Yang Changji urged him to read a radical newspaper, New Youth. The creation of his friend Chen Duxiu, a dean at Peking University. Mao graduated from First Normal School as a teacher in June 1919, ranked third in the year. Mao was invited back to Yali to teach for a short while, and he was later given the position of dean for 3 years. This is the Mao-Yale Skull and Bones Jesuit connection. So he was really quick. Mao was not only in an area where the Jesuits already controlled and were inciting propaganda to get revolution, to get China going with this revolutionary spirit, to get a communist revolution going, but he was also very easily manipulatable. He had very poor character, so the Jesuits could sniff him out right away, give him exactly what he wanted. And he also was at Yali School 3 years a dean in a position of authority. Now, why do you think he became a dean? Well, because they're grooming him to be what they want him to be. Yali School was founded by Yale Skull and Bones members as again, these things are headquarters to do business under the guise of, oh, well, it's like a church, right? It's a headquarters of some kind, especially if it's a Catholic church. So the universities are there under the guise of educating people and benefiting society, but really they're headquarters to spy, to recruit, to promote propaganda and so on. This is what universities are. So if you understand that, then you see the connection between Mao and Yali and Yale and Skull and Bones and the Jesuits and so on. Moving on. Mao's twisted mind is expressed below in these 3 maxims, although I doubt he wrote them. I believe the Jesuits did because this is Jesuit thought in all of its satanic wickedness. These are various, let's see, what is it? Oh, I can't zoom. I'm afraid to zoom out because it'll erase my highlights. But, these are like when there is not enough food that people will starve to death, it is to let the half of people so that the other half can eat it. It basically just really, really disgusting quotes. Very evil, like, there are only 2 genders, male and abortion. Mao Zedong. Just like really crazy guy. Really, really crazy guy. His true character. Mao was a lover of, a P-word, sex addict, and a serial rapist who had a constant stream of young, virgin peasant girls brought to his bedroom day and night, according to his 4th wife, Jing Qing. Mao abandoned all his wives, all 4 of them, and most of his children, 10, having little or no regard for familial love. He usually had a mistress in each of his marriages, which he then used to provoke his wives to anger. Mao was a deceiver and a killer who betrayed and murdered those who closest to him when he felt threatened by them in any way. There he is, having fun with all of his concubines. Mao was also enthusiastic about executions, child labor, torture, and organized public denunciation sessions for political figures who fell out of favor with him. Mao was motivated by a lust for power from an early age and had many political opponents arrested and murdered regardless of their relationship with him. Myths about Mao. Mao never wrote his famous Little Red Book. It is almost certain that Israel Epstein, a skillful propaganda expert and Mao's Minister of Appropriations, did. In 1917, Epstein came to China with his parents at the age of 2, and they settled in Tianjin in 1920. Epstein was a spy for Russia's Red Communist Secret Police. His cover was journalism. He began work in journalism at age 15 when he wrote for the Peking and Tianjin Times, an English-language newspaper owned by the Rothschilds based in Tianjin. He was one of the few foreign-born non-Chinese to become a member of the Communist Party of China. I wonder why. So there he is with Henry, what's his name, Kissinger and Gerald Ford. Everybody's smiling, look at them, peas in the pod, having such a good time in each other's presence, knowing fully aware of their crimes and their evils. So you could read a lot more. There's quite a bit more. There's some photos here that are unfortunately very graphic, but it's very sad and very evil, but this must be known, folks. Remember, the first translation of The Art of War, before 3 years, I believe, before the French Revolution, was done by a Jesuit, Jean-Marie Amiot, and he was in China. That means the Jesuits had been in China for a very long time. producing their educational system and culture shaping and whatever else. The Jesuits probably had their eyes on China for a long time. Just an educated guess. But of course, things happen slowly. Of course, now they happen really quickly, but things had to happen much slower in the past. Nevertheless, through Rothschilds, secret societies, educational institutions, banking, influential figures in government, they can recruit, groom, and induce people into their plans, as you can hopefully see by now. Mao was a very disturbed individual with a lot of psychological issues, but he was the perfect pawn to be seduced with power and fleshly desires. Today, the Roman Catholic Church has a pretty massive dialectic with the Chinese government and the underground Roman Catholic Church. Very interesting dialectic there. I have a whole video on it with, it's called The Pope and His Pet Dragon. There's this whole Vatican agreement to appoint bishops, and there's a lot of, back and forth. It's, again, the typical dialectic stuff. The typical, again, the Catholic apologists will say, look, the Catholic Church is being persecuted. No, it's not. The Catholic Church is the throne of Satan. The throne of Satan is not being persecuted. The throne of Satan is going to be in control until Jesus returns. So then how do you explain these things? Well, you explain them as the necessary resistance to give the Catholic Church justification to be resurrected. It is a resistance, a counterfeit enemy. Remember, there's the counterfeit and the counterfeit enemy. The two hands playing each other's chess, they're both owned by the same entity. So this is the point. And a lot of people don't understand this simple fact. But when you do, you realize how schizophrenic this world is. How absolutely gaslighting and evil and schizophrenic and totally bonkers this clown show of a world is. And that these two sides that are opposing each other are really just governed and controlled by the same being and the same entity. So don't be fooled. China is poised for a religious revival. It has to be. The world will marvel after the beast. That means all of this dialectic and pressure and dualism that you see between communism and the underground Catholic Church and this and that and the institutions warring for control. What you're going to have is the rebirth of religion in that country. And people are so desperate for it. People are so desperate for a little more meaning than this communistic regime. But the communistic regime has served its purpose by being a sword, opposing America, and giving justification to basically create the image of the beast later. Because again, remember, right now we're coming out of this liberalist paradigm. China was the big bad boogeyman. China and communism, Russia a little bit, but really it's China and communism was the big bad boogeyman that the U.S. needed as a way to say, look, they're taking over, so we need to push religion and get out of these liberal values. This is the point. If you have two swords, then you can put them against each other and you can bring about your dialectical scheme. Do you understand? So China was very important to the Jesuits because while they were subverting America in the 1800s, the next goal was China. Now that we have America under control, we have the Federal Reserve, the central bank. We'll talk about all that in the next section. We need a sword to oppose America, to bring communism and to force America to ultimately go very liberal and then swing it back to nationalistic and religious and ultimately create the image of the beast. So all of this is by grand design, and they think on very long time scales, folks. But nevertheless, communist China was brought about by the Jesuits and their influence. And of course, it had a very important purpose to bring the world under the beast. What you see happening in China is just a trial run for what's going to happen at the end of time. How do you think they're going to enforce the mark of the beast? With all of the technologies that you see in China, which, by the way, people like Peter Thiel doing Palantir and Elon Musk, all these people that are coming to rescue you, they're just establishment billionaires that are invested in all of the tracking technology. You think that they're not hungry to implement the same things you see in China? But America, you have to shape the culture. You have to shape the culture and make these things seem like they're needed and, oh, they're good. So it's just one big schizophrenic dialectical gaslighting system. Bread and circuses. It makes no sense for us normal people, relatively normal people. When we see these things, it's so hard to put your mind into the head of these people to where they would do so much destruction just to bring another version of a lie in, the dark to light, the schizophrenic things, the manipulation, the intrigue. It's so hard to put yourself into that position. And I don't think that you should, but you do have to see that these two things are related. These two sides ultimately obey the devil. They're one and the same. They're two birds of the same, two wings of the same bird. Now, again, very important is that the Jews were also part of bringing communism to China. But the question is, who are the Jewish puppet masters? People think that the Jews just kind of took over. The Jews took over. Yeah, they were nothing for 2,000 years and then they suddenly took over the world. How? How does that happen? Well, if you know your history, it doesn't just happen. The Jesuits had all the money. They gave it to the Rothschilds. They propped the Rothschilds up. They were fused to the House of Rothschild. The Rothschilds and all of them were just occult devil worshippers anyway. And so you bring about other people like Mao, like Stalin, like Trotsky, who are hungry to exert their power, and they don't care. They don't have a god. Their god is their own belly. And you just put them in positions of power and they do their bidding. Now, when they get exposed later, oh, it's the Jews. Oh, it must have been the Jews. When in fact, it's actually the people behind the Jews, the unseen hand. That's really important. You have to remember that Satan uses multiple layers of agents, of secret societies, of organizations around the center of his activity. But God reveals to you the center. Do you get it? God reveals to you so brilliantly in one line the center of Satan's activity. In Revelation 13, it doesn't just warn you of a beast that comes out of the sea, this power that oppresses the saints, which in of itself you could still identify the papal power. It says that this is the center of Satan's activity, meaning all things in history are going to be threaded and worked into this agenda. So you don't have to get lost in who did what. You know that even if you don't know how something may be connected, let's say you didn't know that Mao Zedong was a Jesuit puppet. Let's say you didn't know that, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't know that connection. It doesn't matter. If you know that the Jesuits, let me put it this way, if you know that all things have to serve the beast, and you didn't know anything about the French Revolution or the Jesuits or anything else, but you do know who the beast is and what the Bible tells you that the beast is going to be worshipped. Now, put it simply, put the Bible in one hand, put current events in the other. Look at China. Okay, 1.3 billion people. On the surface, there's this atheistic government that controls the people. But under the surface, there's this brimming underground Catholic Church that just needs to come to the surface. It's getting pressed and pushed and given resistance so it can sprout up like a sprout. So you know just that. You know what's current events, what you can see, and you know what the Bible tells you. How do you add 1 + 1 with these, and what do you get? What you get is that there is going to be a massive revival in China. That sounds crazy, but it has to be in order to fulfill the prophecy. Therefore, all of this pressure and push is by design to bring about the justification for really hard swinging to the right to religion and nationalism. That's going to be an interesting thing to see. That will be interesting. That and the Jews converting will be quite a false sign and wonder, for sure. But nevertheless, you have to realize all of these things are related. Let's read about Vietnam. This is politicaltheology.com, article by Michael Graziano. Law and Order, Catholicism in the Vietnam War. When I think about the relations between Catholicism and law and order, I think about Vietnam. I think about the United States' early intervention in the 1950s before Vietnam became a household word for most Americans. I think about 3 documents from my research on American religion and the CIA, a 1954 meeting of President Eisenhower's National Security Council, a 1959 CIA memo, and a best-selling novel. These documents might help us understand why the CIA and the U.S. state, more generally, strategically deployed Catholicism in its imperial actions abroad and how those actions reverberated at home. The first document is a memo recording a 1954 meeting of President Eisenhower's National Security Council. The meeting's goal was to figure out what to do about French Indochina, and especially what is known today as Vietnam. The French Empire was trying to govern Vietnam amidst a communist insurgency, and it was going poorly. The question Eisenhower and his team were wrestling with was this: how do you generate law and order where there is none? How do you build a national identity where one did not previously exist, or where you don't like the one that existed previously? Eisenhower, for his part, thought the answer was in religion. Remember, really quick pause, remember that by now, the United States, by now, meaning now in this article, when Eisenhower was meeting with his people, the United States was taken over. Knights of Malta, Knights of Columbus, secret societies, Freemasons, Jesuits, all this stuff is already well into play. The United States is acting as a sword here for the Catholic Church, not doing its own will against communism. Learning Learning that most Vietnamese were Buddhist, Eisenhower asked whether it would be possible to find a good Buddhist leader to whip up some real fervor. But his team thought not, since, as one explained, unhappily Buddha was a pacifist rather than a fighter. The official records of the State Department note that, at this moment, laughter erupted in the room. The joke, such as it was that the American government knew that Buddhists were nonviolent, and so they could not be counted on to fight for their country. While the Buddhists might not work, there was a sizable Catholic minority that could be used instead. Pay attention, because this is exactly what's going to happen to China, folks. The president was interested and said he wanted to raise up a Joan of Arc to religiously unite Vietnam, and told his team to make sure the Catholics be enlisted. The message was clear. Catholics would listen. Catholics would fight. Catholics would bring along law and order. Fascinating. Of course, there's a lot of involvement there that we can read about. I won't read it to you. But again, the point is clear. Religion and communism are opposites of each other. Good cop, bad cop. Catholicism is the antidote to the poison of communism. Of course, they're both poison, but they're designed to work together. It's like anything else. Like when you get these prescription drugs that they give you. Oh, this causes headache. Oh, now I got to take a drug for my headache. Well, now I have a side effect of diarrhea. Well, here's a drug for diarrhea. It's a constant dialectics. Meanwhile, they're making money. Your body's, being destroyed, and the next person will be in line. So this is how it works. This is a little thing on scapegoating the Jews. We'll read this in just a second. So really quick review of that last article on Vietnam. There's a lot you can read on that. That was just a very brief thing. You can go look into it more yourself. Couple points. The founder of the CIA was Charles Joseph Bonaparte, who was linked to Napoleon Bonaparte. CIA and FBI are full of Knights of Malta members. And of course, all of these will come into play once we discuss Satan's government. But the Jesuits were very involved in Vietnam, just like they were involved in Russia, they were involved in China, and everywhere else in Latin America. The point is that these two things are two sides of the same coin. Problem, reaction, solution. These dialectics are everywhere, from Poland to Germany, Latin America, to the Eastern countries. They're all designed at different times to bring about this religious mindset by giving people something that they hate. Atheism, robbing them of their family, of their personal property, of their identity. Liberalism, homosexuality, all of these things that just destroy people on every level, to the point where there's no spirituality whatsoever. That's when the beast comes in and rescues the people. Again, you have to remember that the devil starts these various threads, and because these people are doing things based on deception, sometimes they get out of hand, and so they have to weaponize other weapons, other secret societies against them to get them to fall in line. So this is what you see throughout all of history. Because again, the devil doesn't do things by love. He does them by fear, by temptation, by desire, by hatred, jealousy, everything that is unstable and built on death. So the devil's constantly having to integrate threads because, let's say, okay, you bring this guy up to power. He does what he's told for 20 years. Then after that, he gets a mind of his own. Oh, okay, well, now we have to start another revolution to bring this guy in. Do you get how that works? So the devil is constantly having to, basically create this empire of sand. And the waves are washing over it, toppling a little bit because they're getting judged. And again, God raises somebody up in judgment, creates a judgment situation. The devil has to scramble and do this. So it's an extremely dynamic involvement. But nevertheless, the Bible tells you that God has allowed the devil to be successful. At the end of time, which is approaching rapidly, he will be successful. That's important. That's the important point to realize. Now, back to this article on Russia. Scapegoating the Jews by Daryl Eberhardt. There's a lot in here to read, but we'll read just a little bit about the Bolsheviks. Let's see, where is the Bolsheviks? Bolsheviks, somewhere in here. Here we go. Russian Revolution. Per Webster's New World Order Dictionary, 4th edition, the revolution of 1917, in which the government of the Tsar was overthrown, it considered of two distinct revolutions. The first, February Revolution, being the uprising of March, in which a parliamentarian government headed by Kerensky came to power. The second, October Revolution, being the uprising of November, October Old Style, in which this government was replaced by the Soviet government, led by the Bolsheviks, communists, under Lenin, to sometimes the October Revolution alone. Oh, I see. Those are the different meanings of it. Editor's comment. We are told by some folks that the Jews financed the Russian or Bolshevik Revolution. Please carefully consider the following quotation. Quote, Another point that is made to convince us that the Jews or the Jewish bankers are the enemy is that Jacob Schiff provided $20 million to finance the Bolshevik revolutions. Did Jacob Schiff really help the Bolsheviks? Because of the progressive dumbing down of our people, most Americans don't realize that there were two Russian revolutions. The first revolution was in March 1917, or February if you use the old calendar. The second was in October of that same year. The March Revolution began in St. Petersburg, where a contingent of military recruits refused to fire on anti-government demonstrators. The Tsar was forced to abdicate. Alexander Kerensky was chosen to lead Russia until the elections would be held. When it became obvious that he intended to continue the war, the German High Command approached Lenin, who was living in Switzerland, and they offered him money and transportation to go to Russia to overthrow Kerensky. During World War I, the American State Department was responsible for collecting intelligence information. Their files confirmed that the fact that Jacob Schiff opposed the Tsar, and after Kerensky had taken power. Jacob Schiff sent Kerensky a telegram congratulating him, but the Bolshevik Revolution didn't take place until 7 months later, when he, the author's Anthony Sutton, examined the State Department's intelligence files. He found evidence that Jacob Schiff opposed the Bolsheviks and encouraged our State Department to oppose them. The document, i.e. the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, first appeared in Russia in 1905. It claimed that the Zionists were behind the wars and revolutions of the 19th century and planned to seize control of the world. Many Russians believed the protocols, and they began to persecute the Jews and to destroy their property. When the Tsar refused to intervene, Jacob Schiff began plotting to depose him. He provided revolutionary literature to the Russian soldiers captured by the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. It is even possible that some of the soldiers who participated in March 1917 revolution read Jacob Schiff's literature, so he may have well played a part in inciting the March Revolution as well, but that was not the Bolshevik Revolution, which occurred 7 months later. When Anthony Sutton researched the State Department intelligence files, he found documents showing that English and American financiers provided funding for the Bolsheviks. But that fact is never mentioned today. Could it be that the story of Jacob Schiff's $20 million gift to the Bolsheviks was contrived to divert attention away from the real source of the funding? Dr. Stanley Monteith, Brotherhood of Darkness, pages 60 through 62. So, a lot to read about that as well. Here's another one. World War I caused by Pope Pius X's hatred of the Orthodox Christians. We'll put this together. All this paints the picture of what happened in Russia. Chapter 6, World War I. This article is from The Secret Terrorists by Bill Hughes. We're going to read a lot about that from Bill Hughes about the history of the United States. So he's got a lot of good stuff in there. Great history book. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife, were in Sarajevo in July 26, 1914. As they made their way through the crowded streets in an open carriage, shots rang out and both of them were dead. The people of Sarajevo were predominantly Serbians. Their religious conviction was that of Orthodox Christians. Since the year 1054, the Catholic Church has been waging war against the Orthodox Christians. 50 years prior to the assassination, the Croatians, who were Catholic, were becoming extremely vocal about their hatred of the Serbians, who were a rival of Rome and needed to be exterminated. Pope Pius X, in his hatred of the Orthodox Christians, was continually inciting Emperor Francis Joseph of Austria-Hungary to chastise the Serbians. After Sarajevo, on July 26th, Baron Ritter, Bavarian representative of the Holy See, wrote this to the government. The Pope approves of Austria's harsh treatment of Serbia. He has no great opinion of the armies of Russia and France in the event of a war with Germany. The Cardinal Secretary of State does not see when Austria could make war if she does not decide to do so now. There, in true colors, is the Vicar of Christ, the Pope, the gentle apostle of peace, the holy pontiff whom pious authors represent as having died for sorrow at seeing the outbreak of war, Edmund Paris, the Vatican, against Europe. Page 14. One may say quite specifically that in 1914 the Roman Catholic Church started the series of hellish wars. It was then that the tribute of blood which she has always taken from the peoples began to swell into a veritable torrent. Same book, page 48. Thus we see that the Pope realized that if Austria-Hungary crushed the Serbs, then the Serbs' Orthodox Christian brothers from Russia would enter the fray. Then Germany, France, and others would join in, and voila, you have World War I. The papacy was thrilled to see Russia enter the conflict. Russia was predominantly Orthodox, and the papacy wanted the Orthodox Christians in Russia and around the world annihilated. The papacy's Jesuits had another reason for being so happy when Russia entered the conflict. It was payback time. About 100 years before World War I began, Alexander I, the Russian emperor, kicked the Jesuits out of Russia. The Russian emperor, Alexander, was currently compelled to issue a royal decree by 1816, by which he expelled them, the Jesuits, from St. Petersburg and Moscow. This proving ineffectual, he issued another in 1820, excluding them entirely from Russian dominions. R.W. Thompson, The Footprints of the Jesuits, page 245 to 246. We looked at this one for the Reductions. 5 years later, Alexander was poisoned to death. The Tsars were under Jesuit attack. Alexander II broke all diplomatic ties with Rome in 1877 and even proposed a constitution. Now, this is so fascinating because the Russia's history is so similar to America's history. They're very similar together. Pay attention to this, and when we get to America's history in the next section, you'll see it's the same thing all over again. Alexander II had progressed well with his great reforms and had attached his signature to a constitution to be adopted by Russia. The next day, a bomb was thrown at his carriage, which killed and wounded a number of Cossacks who accompanied the carriage. The emperor, in deep sympathy, left the carriage to look at the dying men when a second bomb blew him to pieces. Arno Gebelian, Conflict of the Ages, The Exhorters, page 85. Finally, 1917, the last Tsar and all his family were murdered. Never again would a hated emperor from the house of the Romanov rule Russia or ever again protect the Orthodox Church. Payback time had come. The overthrow of the Tsarist system, therefore, brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the established Orthodox Church. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, the downfall of her millenarian rival was too good to be true. Avro Manhattan, The Vatican Billions, Chick Publications. Who was it that aided and financed the Russian revolutionaries in their takeover of Russia? Who backed Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin as they created revolution bloodshed throughout all of Russia? The instruments of this new alliance between the Soviets and the Vatican were to be the Jesuits, described as the hereditary enemies of the Orthodox Church. Reportedly, there were large numbers of representatives of the Jesuit order in Moscow during the Revolution. James Zatko, Descent into Darkness, University of Notre Dame, pages 111. Here's the quote. Among the 1,700,000 whatever victims up to the beginning of the 1922, figures obtained from the Soviet documents, nearly 5,000 were priests, teachers, nuns, etc. of the Orthodox Church. Nearly 100,000 Lutherans banished, whole villages were wiped out, thousands of churches of the different branches have been demolished, and the work of destruction goes on. Arno Gebelian, Conflict of the Ages. The actual Jesuit financiers of the revolution were to be found in America. William Franklin Sands, a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had just contributed $1 million to the Bolsheviks. Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Jacob Schiff was the principal Jesuit in America who was assigned the task of taking over the American banking system and establishing the Federal Reserve. Jacob Schiff came to America in the late 1800s with orders from the Rothschilds to get control of the American banking system. By the turn of the century, 1900, Schiff had mastery of the entire banking fraternity on Wall Street. Myron Fagan, the Illuminati, and the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, really quick pause. When we cover in the next section this in a little more detail, the United States, after the Civil War, was fomented in the United States to punish all the presidents who basically wanted to have independence from Rome. The United States went bankrupt, and as a result, the Rothschilds bought the United States, created the Corporation of the United States, Washington, D.C., and the rest, as they say, is history. And later, 30, 40, 50 years later, the Federal Reserve was basically implemented. And there's a whole story with that too. But the point is, they put them under the central banking model, and everything's under control. So, this is why this corroborates that fact. Because after the Civil War and the Act of, 1872? Whatever it was, either way, in the 1870s, where the federal citizenship was established, the federal government of Washington, D.C. was established, and all the acts of 1872, all these things prompted the next step. Okay, Rothschilds, we're going to send this guy over. Your job is to complete this process and bring them onto a central banking system. And of course, that took a couple decades, but they got it with the Federal Reserve, through these secret societies, through all these people who were in positions of power. Since Schiff had control of the Federal Reserve Bank, he now had a source of money to finance the communist revolution in Russia. In February 3rd, 1949, issue of the New York Journal American, Schiff's grandson John was quoted by columnist Charlie Knickerbocker as saying that his grandfather, Jacob Schiff, had given about $20 million for the triumph of communism in Russia. G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. In today's money, that $20 million would be $420 million, money essentially stolen from the American people through the Federal Reserve Bank. Jacob Schiff was in control of the entire banking fraternity and was financing a government whose avowed principles are in direct antithesis to the United States Constitution. Schiff pretended to be an American capitalist. He was living in America, but his sole objective was that of the papacy, the ultimate destruction of America. There were other goals that the Jesuits hoped to reach with World War I. All the great nations, including the United States, were war-weary, devastated, and mourning their dead. Peace was the great universal desire. Thus, when it was proposed by Woodrow Wilson to set up a League of Nations to ensure peace, all the great nations jumped on the bandwagon without even stopping to read the fine print in the insurance policy. And remember, Council for Relations, UNESCO, these things were Jesuit inventions. So all of this war accomplished multiple purposes. We'll get back to this in just a second. We'll finish this one. After World War I, an attempt was made to set up a one-world government, and the League of Nations was established. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. prevented the United Nations from joining the League of Nations, or the United States from joining the League of Nations. The Jesuits' plot to create a one-world governing body from which they could control the world was stopped only temporarily. This part of the Jesuits' plan had to wait another 27 years for a repeat performance when the Second World War would result in the United Nations. Before we look at yet another reason for the papacy's delight in the First World War, let us look briefly at President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was controlled and dominated by Colonel Edward Mandell House. Wilson said the following: "Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one." Charles Seymour, The Intimate Papers of Colonel House. The 7 long years of Colonel House was Woodrow Wilson's other self. It was House who made the slate for the cabinet, formulated the first policies of the administration, and practically directed the foreign affairs of the United States. He had indeed 2 presidents for one. Super ambassador, he talked to emperors and kings as an equal. He was the spiritual generalissimo of the administration. George Viereck, The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House. Yeah, they just like Mao, just like all these other people, they're puppets. They get people who are puppets and they put them in power. Viereck says on page 106 through 108 that Wilson was running for re-election in 1916 on a platform of "because he kept us out of war." House was negotiating a secret that while Wilson was running on a platform of basically keeping us out of war, House was negotiating a secret agreement with England and France on behalf of Woodrow Wilson that America would enter the war immediately after the election. House was also intimate with the powers centers of money and power in Europe, i.e. the Rothschilds and so on. House had close contacts with J.P. Morgan and the old banking families of Europe. This is by Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Edward Mandell House totally controlled Woodrow Wilson. House was a Jesuit carrying out their every desire. He used Wilson as a puppet to create the League of Nations for the Jesuits. Wilson was nothing more than Rome's tool to do their bidding. In the same book, I'm imagining. Another reason for World War I was to pay back Germany for its opposition to the papacy and the Jesuits in the 1860s and 1870s. Germany was the birthplace of the hated Lutherans. Twice during this time, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck led Germany, known as Prussia, to military victories over the Jesuit-controlled countries of Austria in 1866 and France in 1870. Bismarck also outlawed the Jesuit order with the Kulturkampf law in 1872. These crimes against Rome and the Jesuits had to be repaid in kind. Hence, many thousands of Germans were slain in the bloodbath of World War I. Germany was also the country most affected at the end of the war. The victorious nations of Europe and the Treaty of Versailles to plunder Germany. The treaty imposed such an unfair burden of war reparations on Germany that when the French leader Clemenceau was asked by the press what the leaders had given the world by the treaty, he said, quote, "We have guaranteed another war in 20 years. The Germans agreed to the terms because they were weak and defeated, but they swiftly rebuilt and attempted to pay back their enemies for the debt given to them after World War I. The payback was World War II. And remember, the Catholic Church was all over that. After World War I ended, the Jesuits did not get what they wanted. Woodrow Wilson and Edward Mandell House managed to get them the League of Nations, but it failed miserably because the United States did not join. Therefore, another war was necessary, a war so devastating that people would cry out for a United Nations. This was one of the goals of World War II. We'll look at this and other reasons for World War II in our next chapter. And you can look that up yourself. This is a picture of Tony Blair. What was he doing? Signing some, Tony Blair signing the European Union Constitution in front of a huge statue of the Pope. Here he is, signing the Constitution in Rome with the man of sin behind you telling you to do left or right. So this was what the order of operations is, folks. When it tells you, when you have George Washington's monument or, whatever, bust, and it says Freemason and first president, what's on top is determining what's on bottom. Does that make sense? That's the order of operations. Freemason is first, therefore his allegiances were to the occult, not to your country, even though on the outside it seemed that way. When these people are signing at their table, and you have the EO here with a little circle of stars, and on top of this is this giant effigy, this giant statue of the man of sin, standing there, blessing this union. You know what the order of operations is, folks. This is so obvious. It's so clear. So the Jews aren't the ones who rule the world, and certainly the Jews aren't the ones who brought communism to the world originally. Conclusion. Remember that the Vatican, plus the Knights of Malta, plus Jesuits, plus secret societies have infiltrated everywhere. The Knights of Malta and the Vatican both have a permanent observer status with the United Nations, which is a Jesuit creation. So what does that tell you? It tells you that all of this liberal New World Order and WEF and, International Monetary Fund and globalists is just a ruse. It's a ruse designed to make you go from one to another and to basically prefer the solution that's being provided to you in opposition to this counterfeit enemy. All of these organizations are just subservient organizations to the beast. They may play an atheistic role, a liberal role, but they are playing their part to magnify the glory of the beast. Do you get it? They're designed to create an echo chamber in the world. And of course, that echo chamber is to make people demand a new world order. The final revolution, which we are undergoing right now, is a revolution where people will demand to be oppressed. They will desire to be oppressed. They will demand a new world order, and they'll think it's a good thing. Once the image of the beast is completed in America, it's going to be exported to the rest of the world, and you'll see some examples of that in the next the final section of this, which is the current events. And of course, that's going to set the stage for the world to marvel after the beast. If all this sounds crazy, watch all of my news updates. We'll have a news update in this particular segment, in the final segment here with current events, and you'll see how it all ties together. But back to Russia and Orthodoxy and everything else, you have to remember the Orthodox split from Catholicism. Now, Satan is not going to let you just do your own thing over there as a harlot daughter. He's going to punish you and bring you back into the fold. And that's exactly what happened with all of these intrigues. A lot of these monarchs and monarchies that rebelled to the Catholic Church were punished with World War I. Especially Russia was a huge empire. Obviously, they had a monarch. They had orthodoxy. They were their own thing. They're a competitor to the snake, right? The snake's not going to let you have your own sovereign state, because then you're going to eventually think like, well, maybe I'm the grand poobah. So the snake is not going to let you do that. So the revolutions in Russia were, first off, World War I was created to punish Russia and to bring Russia into war and create all of these dialectics and to destroy a lot of people who basically were disobedient to the beast and kick the Jesuits out, like Russia, like Germany, and so on and so forth. But it also created the justification for these other communistic revolutions, which were further used to depose the monarchy and punish millions and millions of people. That's why, by the way, the Holocaust is used to hide the real murdering that happened, which is the Holodomor, and the millions of people that died in communism, which, of course, if you dig deep enough, you know who is behind that. So all of these things are just smoke screens, folks, to hide the real enemy in history, which, of course, is the seed of Satan. Also, the issue with the Zionists, with Theodor Herzl, Moses Hess, all these people creating the state of Israel eventually, there's an issue with that because communism created the precedent for World War II, which recreated the European landscape and basically indentured nations to the Rothschilds. This is the plan. Send everybody to war with revolutions, put people against each other. They have to borrow money, and then whoever wins or loses doesn't matter. You own both sides. It created a legal action to bring about the Jewish state also. So there is a connection to the Zionist agenda. Again, all these, it's as I'm relaying these things to you, it's truly astounding to me how these things are being done simultaneously. It really is. Like, these people just don't sleep. They're just completely driven by the satanic power to do all these evil things constantly. It's truly amazing. It's truly amazing. So basically, while all of these intrigues with communism and 2 world wars were happening, all the stuff with Zionism was happening, State of Israel, secret societies, bringing people there, dispensationalism going out through all of America, unifying Americans, in one delusion to send money to this project through Christian Zionism. And of course, everywhere else in the world, like Latin America, China, everywhere else that you've seen, communist revolutions were happening simultaneously. Like, how are you people doing it? The only answer is that you are basically operating by the power of Satan. That all of the testimonies against you as a group, like with Helena Blavatsky saying that you use black magic, it has to be the case. It has to be that they are being powered and advised and governed by Satan, ultimately. So it's truly amazing, but history reveals to us the answer. Also notice the same patterns too. The true bankrollers of the Bolsheviks were Jesuits, Knights of Malta people in the United States, and all of that was done under the cover of a Jew, Jacob Schiff, to say, oh, he's the Jews who funded the Bolsheviks. But in fact, they were playing both sides. And on the surface, it was just basically theirs to create a dialectic that you could blame the Jews. But in fact, he was just a Jesuit doing his orders. He was sent by the Rothschilds to take over the American banking supply, create a central bank. And then, of course, once that was done and accomplished, okay, let's move some money from America to this new project and punish the Orthodox and so on. So wrapping this crazy part up, we looked at Latin America, we looked at Russia, we looked at China, we looked throughout the world. The Jesuits are to always be found at every single revolution and intrigue in the last 500 years. I have belabored to document for you so much of this so that you can see proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that when it comes down to it, the Bible is true, the mother of abominations of the earth. That means, very important conclusion now that we have all of this history, what does that mean? That means that what is happening right now is nothing new under the sun, folks. Do you get it? It's nothing new under the sun. It's not an organic awakening. It's not a great awakening. It's a great delusion, because this is a choreographed self-destruction, controlled demolition, really, of communism. Communism was raised up by this power to make itself look good. And now it's a controlled demolition to bring in the true New World Order, which is going to be a false light New World Order. Trump and MAGA, there's no difference between that and the French Revolution, the Bolshevik revolutions, all these other communist revolutions. There's nothing different. This is just French Revolution 2.0, except it's going in the other direction, towards religion and towards the beast. Whenever the people need a leader, he is propped up. Trump is blackmailed. He's part of secret societies. He's in the club. He is doing the bidding of his Jesuit masters. So, very important. The atheistic communistic system is coming to an end, but Catholic communism is about to begin. Don't think that we're entering a golden age. We are entering the biggest reduction of history. Do you get it? They've been practicing this for a very long time, because the ultimate goal is to put the whole world in line under the beast. And so now we're going from one communist paradigm to another communist paradigm. Communism is just really absolute papal control. Absolute control. You have no rights. You have nothing unless you participate in the system. And that's exactly what it's going to be. But people are going to be deceived into thinking that this version of communism that's coming is a good thing. And that's the totalitarian Catholic world deception that's coming. So that's on the horizon, folks. The beast is about to be resurrected. I talk about that quite a bit in my End Time series, but either way, understanding the true origins of communism is very important. It helps you to see that all of this crazy dialectical stuff that's happening is not by accident. It's not stuff that just happens. And we just happen to vote Trump in, and now he's happening to take down this deep state, and we're happening to go into this golden age, and things are just getting better because we made a choice. That is the synergistic delusion. That is the delusion that tries to suck you into the level of the chessboard so that you don't see the hands. You just say, oh, well, that piece is moving over there, and that one moved over there. I guess we got to do this, and we made it. You have to pull yourself out of that with a biblical and historical perspective. so that you can see the devil under the table playing himself. You have to wake up from the "it's the Jews" pill that people are taking, because it's not the Jews. You have to wake up from the idea that religious nationalism is coming to save you from this dark, evil, liberal order. No, the liberal order was designed to make the final New World Order look appealing. Remember, there's a true counterfeit and a fake counterfeit. I'll say it again. There's a true enemy, which is the devil, and a fake enemy that the devil has to prop up to pretend that he's the savior. Otherwise, you're going to know that he's the enemy. So this is the point. People are just seduced so easily, and they're seduced by way of rebellion, by the way. This is another important point to see with the devil's tactics, which is that when you read the Bible, and especially the New Testament, its approach to suffering is to basically submit to God. Submit to God, rejoice, because God is confirming your election through these experiences when you suffer, when you're going through hardships. Rejoice, stand fast, endure, trust in the Lord, be patient. Those are the messages that you get from the New Testament. The opposite of that is rebellion. It is taking salvation into your own hands. And that is exactly the poison that the devil uses through synergism. The devil raises up a counterfeit enemy, and that counterfeit enemy is designed to cause you a lot of trouble. To push at you, to pull at you, to call you names, to take away your rights, to do this, to do that. So that, what? So that it evokes a response and throws you into the synergistic mindset through rebellion. Rebellion to tyranny is resistance? Rebellion to tyranny is obedience to God, or something like that. I think Ben Franklin is quoted for that particular quote. But this is the way people are getting sucked into it today. They're getting gaslit to make you feel that, number one, rebelling is a good thing, and not rebelling and trusting God is a bad thing. I covered in one of my Venerable Day of the Sun episodes these clowns like Lance Wallnau and what's the other guy's name? I forget. Anyway, these NAR prophets, false prophets that are like, well, if you don't vote, if you don't get out and vote, like you're siding with abortion, you're siding with all this evil, dark, deep state stuff. You're siding with Tranny Time Story Hour. If you don't do this, that is designed to evoke in you an emotion that, oh my gosh, I need to do something. I need to do something. And when you do that, you're off balance. Do you get it? You don't think critically. You are not sober-minded. And that's the point. It's designed to put an emotion in you, to throw a little flaming dart at you so that it consumes your mind and say, I need to do it. Otherwise I don't want to be like those. I don't want to be supporting Tranny Time Story Hour. And it's designed to light you on fire and get you into that chessboard so that you have no perspective. That's why you have to use the shield of faith and rely on God's sovereignty. And remember that all things are predetermined, and they will be revealing God's glory, whether you understand that right now or not. So that's the point. But the devil doesn't want you to do that. The point is to do these dialectics to make you rebel. And in rebelling, you become manipulated. Do you understand? That's the profound truth of all of this, folks. When you rebel, these people like with MAGA, we got to rebel against the system, right? We got to rebel against the deep state. And that promises to you freedom. It promises to you freedom that you got to take your rights. We have to, defend the Constitution. You got to do it. And in doing it, you're exercising your freedom. And we would freedom and this and Braveheart memes and all kinds of stuff. But in reality, you're actually becoming a slave. Do you get it? You're becoming a slave because you're getting sucked right into that first-person view. That first-person view of the chessboard. And you have no clue who's actually pulling the strings. And that is the point. That you get sucked into the dialectic. It's designed to evoke a response and to throw you into the synergistic mindset. It's designed to make you rebel. So the evil, the counterfeit evil, is designed to make you rebel so that the true evil, which is the false light, can come in and be your savior. Because that is how the devil does things. He does things through rebellion. He offers you rebellion, whereas God tells you to wait on the Lord and to obey because vengeance is his. So two different paradigms. For the devil's paradigm, you must do something. It's up to you. Uncle Sam wants you. Rosie the Riveter flexing her bicep. You can do it. Everything is about rebellion. And of course, rebellion in this day and age, especially if it's against the counterfeit enemy, is seen as a virtue. It's seen as a virtue to go out and vote against the deep state. That's the mindset that people are in. And as a result, they're so easily manipulated into the final deception. That's why the Bible tells you that the world is going to marvel after the beast. So the point here is, do not be baited into this trap. Don't be baited into the devil's synergistic trap, but rather get edified on the true gospel, which is the monergistic gospel. God is able to save regardless of your cooperation. And that is the basis of the good news, that God is sovereign. It's not based on you being sovereign and clipping the coupon that God offers you with a yes, please, I'm freely electing to be saved. No, the good news of the gospel is that God is sovereign over all things. And when you come into the awareness of faith, which is given to you as a gift, it's not given to everybody, you realize that that cannot be lost because God will preserve you. And that is the source of eternal security, of God, of good news, of peace beyond understanding, of joy, of the strength that you will need in times of suffering. To know that even though you're having doubts, even though you're wondering, why is God giving me all these problems? Why this, why that God will not put it against you, and he has determined to save you, and he will persevere you. That is the source of the good news. If you don't have that, you do not have a gospel. And of course, today, at the end of the Counter-Reformation, where Protestants have believed Catholic soteriology, minus the sacramental system, but we're going to get there again pretty soon. Synergistic philosophy. It's up to you. All these man-centered gospels, prosperity preaching has done a number on people. We have lukewarm faith. Nobody believes in the sovereignty of God. Everybody's insulted by the sovereignty of God. And they accuse people like me who talk about predestination and these beautiful truths as being cult members, deceived, blah, 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 whatever else. This is the day we live in, folks. So you have to get edified on the truth, because that gives you the strength to endure and to see through these deceptions. If you are a synergist, you are not in a good position to avoid deception. You really aren't. Because synergism is the devil's invention, and the devil is a master at synergism and baiting you with synergistic things. You'll see in the current events section of this, when we have the final section, the level of gaslighting being done to bait you with blasphemy and with liberal destruction into saying enough is enough. We need to take over. We need to do it. Rather than saying, you know what? There's a lot of evil here. God is going to sort it out. I'm going to trust in God. I'm going to keep spreading the gospel, treat my neighbor with love as much as I can, and just wait on the Lord. That is the last thing that the devil wants you to do. So he has cultivated a culture of rebellion since the French Revolution. Rebellion, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God, which of course is absolute nonsense. God is never, not in the New Testament, at least in the Old Testament, it was necessary to have war and nationalism because that was the physical Israel. But in the New Testament, Christ is king. He's in heaven. He's ruling. It's a done deal. You don't need to worry about government stuff. The enemies are being put under his feet. So you don't need to worry about it. This is the delusion. Either way, now that we've covered some very important history with the truth about communism, it's time to finally turn our attention to the United States, which is the false prophet and which has a very important role in bringing about the Great Delusion. The United States was set up by deists and Freemasons, people who didn't really believe the gospel whatsoever, and you'll see that, and is a harlot daughter of Mystery Babylon in many ways. So it was very quickly subjugated by Rome to serve her interests. Today, the United States is set to bring the image of the beast to the world through people like Trump and through working many false signs and wonders, which we'll talk about. But understanding how the United States was taken over by the Jesuits and reined in to this Antichrist power structure is very important so that we can understand current events correctly. So onward to part 6, the false prophet.